I've always thought small towns carried a quiet weight, not the kind of weight that makes your shoulders ache, or the kind that presses down when you stayed up too long. It's subtler than that. It's in the way streets seem almost too empty for the time of day, in the way the houses sit too close together, like they're huddling against something you can't see. I moved here 6 months ago, thinking I'd found peace after the city's chaos, but Willow Lane has a way of settling into your chest that feels heavier than it should. People talk about it like it's normal. They wave at strangers, invite you over for barbecues, laugh when you joke about the quiet. But there's a stillness under the smiles, a pause before they respond, like the town itself is listening, waiting for something. It's easiest to notice at night, when the streetlights flicker and the wind moves through the trees in long, lazy sways. That's when the quiet becomes its own kind of noise. I first noticed the absence when I was walking home from a small grocery store on the corner. There's a little bell over the door that jingles whenever someone comes in, a sound so familiar it usually makes me feel safe. That night, it felt wrong. The air smelled colder than it should have, and the usual chatter from a night shift clerks had stopped. I didn't think much of it until I got to Willow Lane and saw the street empty, even though it was only 8 o'clock. Normally, kids will be biking back from friend houses, or the neighbor's dog will be barking at something unseen. But that night, not a sound, just the quiet. The disappearance came later, though I didn't know it at the time. A week after that walk, I was scrolling to the town's online forum, the sort where locals post missing cats and garage sales, when I stumbled across a thread that made my stomach drop. It wasn't dramatic, just a single post from someone named Marcy, a woman who lives 3 houses down from me. "Has anyone seen Katie?" It read. She didn't come home from school yesterday. Katie. The name felt small, fragile. I didn't know her, but somehow, reading it made the quiet on Willow Lane press harder against my ears. There were comments from people saying she probably got held up somewhere, that she was just late, but one reply stood out. Check Willow Lane. Something doesn't feel right there. I closed the laptop and sat in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that makes your own thoughts sound loud and wrong. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that small towns have disappearances and strange feelings all the time, but the feeling didn't leave me. Willow Lane felt like it was holding its breath, and I couldn't tell if it was protecting something or warning me. The next day, I decided to walk down the street again. Daylight made it feel safer, but not safe. The houses were all neat, with flower beds and freshly mowed lawns, the way towns make themselves look lived in. I could see curtains twitching occasionally, neighbors peeking out, maybe judging me for looking so long and so hard. I noticed one house in particular, number 14, where Katie lived. The front door was closed, the mailbox slightly open, and I could see her bike leaned against the side of the porch, dust gathering on it like it hadn't been used in days. I didn't knock. I didn't want to. I just stood there, feeling the weight of the lane pressing in, the shadows in the corners of the street stretching just a little too long. Something about the way the wind had shifted made me realize I could hear my own heartbeat, and then I thought I heard something else. A soft shuffle, like someone moving just behind curtain. But when I looked, no one was there, just the quiet. It became clear that Willow Lane has a rhythm of its own. There's a normal life you see, people mowing lawns, walking dogs, laughing when a child runs past. And then there's the undercurrent, the parts of the street that don't appear in the light of day, that twist just beyond vision. At night, they feel alive. They're in the hollows between the streetlights, in the way the trees sway even when the air is still. And when you walk past number 14, past Katie's empty bike, you feel it pressing against you. I started noticing little things over the next few nights. Footsteps behind me that stopped when I turned. Windows that seemed to catch movement when I walked by, though no one should be there. Once, I swore I heard someone whisper my name. It was so soft I thought I'd imagined it, but my skin tingled and my chest felt tight, like I just remembered something terrible I didn't want to. People in town didn't talk about these things. Or if they did, they whispered them in corners, their eyes darting to the empty streets like they were afraid someone or something was listening. I asked around once, tried to casually mention Katie and the odd feeling of the lane. Old man Henderson, who runs a hardware store, shook his head and said, "You've got a young mind, son. Quiet streets make people imagine things." But there was something in his voice, a hesitation that told me he knew more than he let on. I started walking Willow Lane at odd hours, trying to understand. My steps were soft on the asphalt. I felt my own presence stretch across the shadows. I'd pass the streetlights and watch the dark spaces in between, waiting for the invisible to appear. I don't know if I wanted to see it or not. Most nights, nothing happened, and I convinced myself it was all in my head. But some nights, I'd see shapes just beyond the corner of my vision, faces and windows that vanished when I looked directly, a flicker of movement by the trees. Katie's disappearance had left a hole in the street, in the air itself. You could feel it when you walked past number 14. The empty bike, the still porch, the untouched mailbox, all of it was like a memory stuck in amber, something waiting to be remembered. I started thinking about her, what she might have seen before she vanished. The last time someone saw her, where had she been? Did she walk alone down the same street? Feeling the shadows pressing closer with every step, I began keeping a small notebook, jotting down everything I noticed. Every shadow, every twitch of movement, every shift in the wind. It wasn't much, just a collection of observations that made me feel slightly more in control. But sometimes I'd find notes I hadn't written, scrawled in handwriting that wasn't mine. One evening, I flipped open a notebook to a blank page, and at the bottom in tiny letters it said, "She's still here." I froze. My hand hovered over the pen, my heart hammering. I told myself it was a joke, a trick of my mind, but the unease didn't fade. Willow Lane has a rhythm that isn't friendly to outsiders, or even to those who live there. You feel it in your chest, in the hollow spaces behind your eyes, in the way your breath catches when the wind shifts. It's like walking through a town that remembers everything, including the things you wanted to forget. And as night falls, the streetlights flicker and the shadows stretch long. I can't stop thinking about Katie, about the moment she disappeared, about the empty spaces she left behind. The lane waits for the next sound, the next movement, the next person to notice that the quiet isn't peaceful. It's hungry. I haven't seen her, and maybe I never will. But every time I pass number 14, every time I hear a floorboard creak in the dark, I feel the absence pressing close. Willow Lane doesn't forgive curiosity. It doesn't answer questions. It only watches and waits, and holds its secrets in the spaces between the streetlights. And I know, in some corner of my mind, that the moment I feel safe, that's when it will reach for me too. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was the wind. Willow Lane has that kind of wind. It slips through the trees and the spaces between houses, bending around corners, curling through cracks in doors and windows, and it carries a sound that almost seems human. I told myself that's all it was at first, just the wind. But as the night stretched longer, the whispers didn't feel random. They felt deliberate, like someone or something was speaking to me in tones just beyond comprehension. It started around midnight. I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to make sense of my notes on Katie, scribbles that made less and less sense as I stared at them under the dim glow of the lamp. My apartment isn't far from Willow Lane, maybe 2 blocks away, but at that hour the street is swallowed by darkness, the kind of darkness that feels solid. You could stumble through it and it would leave no mark, as if it was swallowing sound along with sight. And that night, as I drank lukewarm coffee, I heard it, a faint, shivering sound, almost like someone speaking softly from the other side of the street. I froze, my mug halfway to my lips. The whispering wasn't words. Exactly. Not that I could understand. It was more like fragments, syllables that collided and lingered in the air longer than they should. A pause, a breath, then it shifted, sliding over the edge of perception and vanished. I stood, heart pounding, and pressed my face to the window. The street was empty. Nothing moved. No lights flickered. Not even the dog from across the lane barked. Just the quiet. The next night, I heard it again, this time closer. It came from the direction of number 14, Katie's house. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to go outside, but my curiosity, that same thing that had drawn me to Willow Lane in the first place, made me step onto the porch. The air was thick, like it had weight, and every sound I made seemed amplified. My shoes scraped against cracked pavement, and the whispering stopped. Silence pressed in on me so hard I could feel it behind my eyes. I remember leaning forward, squinting into the shadows, and that's when I saw it, or thought I did, a shadow moving against the side of the house. It didn't make sense the way it moved, not like a person walking, more like someone sliding along the edges, brushing the wall with careful, deliberate motions. I called out, my voice trembling more than I wanted. "Hello?" Nothing, just the whisper of leaves in the wind, or maybe it was the whisper again. I couldn't tell. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, hands still shaking. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak in the apartment felt like footsteps. Every shadow stretching along the wall seemed alive. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, that my brain was feeding on the story of Katie and the emptiness of Willow Lane. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was moving just out of sight, waiting for me to look in the wrong place. By the third night, I decided to see if anyone else had noticed. I went online, scrolling to the town forum, old threads, police reports, even obscure neighborhood posts from months ago. That's when I found it. Dozens of people mentioning noises at night, whispers from empty streets, footsteps in the dark, fleeting shadows crossing windows. Most dismissed it as kids playing pranks or the wind or the imagination of small-town folk. But a few comments stood out. I hear her voice sometimes. Something watches me when the street is empty. Don't walk past number 14 alone at night. Reading it made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. I realized I wasn't imagining it. There was a pattern. Willow Lane had been holding on to something for a long time, and maybe Katie hadn't been the first to vanish. The thought made my chest tighten. There's a subtle difference between fear and knowledge, and that night I felt both. I started walking the street again, later than I ever had before. The streetlights flickered, long shadows stretching like fingers across the pavement. The houses were dark, windows reflecting nothing but my own tense face as I moved. And then I heard it, the whisper, again, this time unmistakable. It came from behind the trees, near Katie's house. Soft, almost mournful, curling around my ears. I froze, listening. Help! It sounded like a child, but it didn't have the warmth of life in it. It was hollow, empty, echoing as though the voice had been trapped in the shadows for too long. I wanted to run, but my feet were frozen. I strained my eyes, trying to catch the source, and that's when I saw a movement again. Something shifting just behind the thick trunk of a tree. Too dark to see clearly, too deliberate to ignore. It didn't step forward. It didn't step back. It just lingered in the edge of vision, as if testing me, trying to see how much fear I could hold before breaking. I backed away slowly, my breath visible in the cold night air. Every step I took made the whispers grow louder, more urgent, but never clear. When I reached the corner, I dared to glance back. Nothing, just the empty street, and the way the shadows clung to the walls of the houses. But the sense of being watched didn't leave me. It followed me home, curling around my shoulders, settling in the hollow of my chest. That night, sleep didn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was over, that the whispers were only the wind. But I could hear them, faint, almost imperceptible, coming through the walls of my apartment. It was never the same sound twice. Sometimes it was a soft word, sometimes a shiver, sometimes the faintest echo of laughter, and always, it seemed to be coming from the direction of Willow Lane. The whispers became a rhythm I couldn't escape. I found myself listening for them during the day, imagining the shapes behind windows, the figures hiding just out of sight. Every time I passed Katie's house, the air seemed to shift, heavier than before, like the street itself was breathing. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw a movement in the shadows. Not solid, not fully formed, but enough to make me doubt the safety of any place on that street. I spoke to Henderson again. I tried to ask casually about the noises, the shadows, anything unusual after dark. He shook his head slowly, eyes narrowing. Son, some streets aren't meant for wandering at night. Some things in small towns, they don't want attention. Best you leave it be. I wanted to press him, wanted to demand he tell me more, but the warning in his voice stopped me. There's a kind of fear that doesn't come from what you see, but from what other people refuse to say, and Henderson's warning carried that fear straight into my bones. After that, I started carrying a small flashlight when I walked Willow Lane at night. The beam doesn't do much. Shadows stretch, shapes bend, and the whispering persists. It's louder near number 14, almost like the house itself is breathing in anticipation. I've started noticing things I can't explain. A curtain twitching when no one is behind it. Footsteps that stop when I look in the direction they came from. A faint echo of laughter that dissolves before it reaches me. The more I try to make sense of it, the more the street refuses to be understood. There's a rhythm, a pulse, a secret life to Willow Lane that no one talks about. The whispers are part of it, carrying fragments of memory, echoes of things that happened long before I arrived. Sometimes, I think they're calling out for Katie. Other times, I think they're warning me. I don't know which is worse. And yet, every night, I walk the street, because the curiosity that brought me here in the first place hasn't left. Because the quiet, the shadows, the whispers, they pull at something inside me, demanding I pay attention. And I do. I don't know how long this will last, or if I'll ever feel safe on Willow Lane again. But I do know this. The whispers are patient. They wait for you to notice them. And once you do, you can't stop listening. I've walked Willow Lane at night more times than I can count now. But nothing unsettled me as much as the house at number 16. It sits right next to Katie's, an old Victorian with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and windows that seem to stare blankly at the street. I first noticed it on one of my late-night walks, its shutters rattling gently in the wind. The faint smell of damp would curling out from the cracks in the door. People avoid it. Kids dare each other to touch the front steps. And even Henderson never goes past it unless he has to. There's something about the place that doesn't feel human. I don't know why I decided to go inside. Curiosity, I guess. Maybe a need to see the shadows for myself. To understand if Katie's disappearance was somehow tied to it. The front door was locked, but not properly. The old lock had rusted through, leaving the door hanging slightly ajar. My hand hovered over the knob, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. I pushed the door slowly, and it creaked, the sound echoing down the empty hallway like it was mocking me. The house was darker than the street outside, and the walls seemed to absorb every sound I made. My footsteps were soft, tentative, on warped wooden floors that moaned under my weight. I could hear the wind outside rattling the shutters, but inside, there was a deeper sound, a faint scratching, almost like nails dragging along the walls. I stopped, heart racing. There was nothing there, and yet the noise persisted, shifting from one side of the hallway to the other, just out of reach. I made my way to the living room, where the wallpaper had curled and yellowed, peeling in jagged strips. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the shapes of chairs and sofas distorted and ghostly. Dust motes floated in the thin streams of light that managed to slip through the grimy windows. I ran my fingers along the edge of a coffee table, and it left a trail in the dust. Nothing else moved. Nothing else should have been here. And then I felt it, that prickling along the back of my neck, the kind of awareness that tells you someone is watching. I turned slowly, scanning the room. Shadows clung to the corners, thick and unmoving. The shape of the fireplace loomed like a black mouth. My eyes traced every wall, every darkened doorway. Nothing, and yet the feeling didn't leave. I whispered, "Hello?" My voice sounded absurdly loud, bouncing off the walls. No answer, but the sensation persisted, the weight of eyes unseen, measuring me, calculating me. I moved toward the staircase. It groaned under my weight, each step sounding impossibly loud in the empty house. I kept my hand along the banister, though the wood was cold and rough against my palm. Upstairs, the hallway stretched into darkness, doors lining each side. Some were closed, others slightly ajar, revealing rooms shrouded in shadow. I felt drawn to one in particular, the door at the far end. It had scratches around the frame, long, deep lines as if someone or something had tried to escape or force its way out. I pushed it open. The room was empty. A bed, stripped bare, a dresser with its drawers hanging open, and a faint outline of pictures that had long since faded. But in the corner, something caught my eye, a small pile of dust, disturbed, as if someone had recently crouched there, hidden, waiting. I froze. The air felt heavier in that corner, colder, like it had been exhaling toward me the entire time I had been in the room. I told myself it was nothing, that the house had settled, that dust shifts on its own, but instinct screamed otherwise. I stepped closer, and then I saw it. Faint impressions in the dust, tiny footprints, not human, not like anything I could place. They led from the corner toward the window, then vanished. I knelt to examine them, tracing the tiny shapes with my fingers. They were hollow, almost smudged, as if whatever made them had been partially erased. My chest tightened, the sense of being watched intensified, as if every shadow in the room had turned to follow me. I backed away, but the feeling didn't fade. I could hear faint scratching again, closer now, along the wall near the door. My hand went to my mouth to stifle a gasp. I wanted to run, but I wanted to see it too, whatever was here. I stepped toward the hallway and stopped. At the far end, in the doorway I had just come from, a shadow moved. Not a human shadow. It didn't match any shape I recognized. It was dark, yes, but it shifted in ways shadows don't, stretching and curling like smoke caught in a draft. I blinked. It was gone, but the memory of it stayed in my mind, and my pulse raced as if it had followed me into the next room. I tried the other doors. One led to a bathroom. The tiles cracked and stained. The mirror had long since clouded, but I swore I saw movement in its surface, a flicker that didn't match my own reflection. Another door opened onto what must have been a child's room. Broken toys lay scattered across the floor, and the air smelled faintly of something sweet, like candy left too long in the sun. There were more footprints, smaller this time, smeared across the floorboards. They stopped abruptly at the wall, as though the room itself had swallowed them. By the time I returned to the staircase, I was shaking. My own breath sounded wrong in the quiet of the house, each exhale too loud, each heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Houses make noises. Dust shifts, shadows move. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been following me, tracking my every step, waiting for me to notice it. I went back down, moving toward the front door. The hallway seemed longer, the shadows deeper, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing from every corner. I paused at the doorway, hand on the knob, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a face in the glass, pale, blurred, watching me, before vanishing when I blinked. My stomach lurched, and I stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air, the night outside suddenly feeling unbearably loud. The street was empty, as it always was at that hour, but I could still feel the gaze following me, lingering on my back as I walked home. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the shadows stretching across the lawn, the way the house seemed to sigh behind me, content in its secrets. I told myself I was done, that I wouldn't go back inside. That curiosity had nearly cost me enough tonight. But Willow Lane has a way of calling you back, of pulling at the parts of your mind you try to hide even from yourself. Later that night, lying in bed, I could feel it again, the weight of the house pressing in from across the street, the whispers I had ignored earlier now more insistent, as if echoing through the walls of my own apartment. Tiny creaks, the brush of something against the siding, footsteps that stopped whenever I turned my head. The empty house isn't empty. I can't prove it. I can't touch it. But I can feel it. I keep thinking about the footprints, the shadows, the small, hollow impressions in the dust. Something is living in that house. Or maybe something has been trapped there for years. And I know somehow that Katie saw it too before she vanished. I don't know if I'm looking for her, or if I'm looking for whatever took her, or if it's just curiosity eating at me until I can't resist anymore. I know one thing for sure. I will walk past that house again. I will see the windows, the peeling paint, the sagging porch, and I will feel the eyes on me, waiting, because Willow Lane doesn't forgive curiosity. It doesn't give answers. It only watches and waits and reminds you that some houses are never truly empty, no matter how long the world forgets them. And somewhere in the shadows, I can feel it moving, I never thought the quiet of Willow Lane could feel heavier than it already did, but it does. It presses into your chest and into the hollow behind your eyes, the place where imagination and memory twist together. Nights have a way of dragging longer here, stretching shadows until they seem solid, almost alive. And the absence of Katie, that absence has a weight of its own. The first week after she disappeared, I tried to convince myself it was temporary. She wandered somewhere, gotten distracted. Someone would bring her home. The police asked questions, left posters, and knocked on doors. But as the hours turned into days, the certainty that something gone terribly wrong began to settle like a stone in my stomach. I started walking the street more, even during the day, watching windows, counting doors, trying to catch a glimpse of life returning where it had been stolen. But Willow Lane didn't give answers. I remember the morning I found her backpack lying in the corner of her bedroom. Her parents had been frantic, blaming themselves, blaming the town, blaming everything they could think of except the truth. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the straps, and for a moment, I thought I could feel her there, the weight of her body still fresh. But it was empty. The zipper had been left slightly open, the contents scattered, a notebook, a water bottle, a pencil with a chewed end, and nothing more. Just the echo of her presence, a whisper frozen in time. I began visiting the house at number 14 more often. I know that sounds insane. Maybe it is. But I needed to see it to confront the emptiness, to make sense of the void that the rest of the street seemed to ignore. I would walk past the porch, glance at the empty bike, and sometimes, I thought I saw a movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow perhaps shifting too quickly to be human. I told myself it was fatigue, imagination, the way grief distorts reality. But each night, the feeling grew stronger, more insistent, like the street itself was whispering secrets I wasn't ready to hear. Then came the night I heard her voice. I don't mean a whisper carried by the wind or the scratch of something on the walls. I mean her voice, soft, distant, calling my name. It came from the direction of the abandoned house next door. My stomach dropped, my hands grew clammy, and my chest tightened as though I had swallowed a fist. I walked toward it, slow steps, breath shallow, each footfall seeming impossibly loud. The closer I got, the clearer it became, though still just beyond comprehension. Help me? I stopped at the gate, staring through the broken boards of the fence. Nothing moved, no one, and yet the sound persisted, curling around me, tugging at my mind. I wanted to run, but I also wanted to see. I wanted to know if it was real, if there was a way to bring her back, if this street had somehow swallowed her whole. I called out. My voice felt useless. Empty. There was no reply, just the faintest echo of that voice, vanishing as quickly as it came. Days blurred together after that. I began sleeping poorly, haunted by dreams of Willow Lane stretching into darkness. In those dreams, the houses leaned in closer. Shadows reached out for me, and Katie's laughter, her voice, was everywhere and nowhere. I woke screaming more than once, feeling the cold press of the night against my skin, wondering if the shadows from my dreams had followed me into the waking world. I tried to talk to people, anyone who might have seen something, anyone who might understand, but small towns bury things quietly. I asked neighbors, teachers, shopkeepers. Most shook their heads, offered empty reassurances, or quickly changed the subject. A few older residents looked at me strangely, as if they had long known that some stories aren't meant to be solved. Their eyes held a kind of sadness that wasn't for Katie alone, but for something bigger, something unspeakable lurking beneath the calm surface of the lane. The police eventually called off the active search. "We've done everything we can," they said. "Sometimes kids run away or vanish, and there's nothing to indicate foul play. We'll keep her file open, but the pause, the unspoken words, cut deeper than anything else." The realization hit me like a wave. There might be no trace, no body, no answers, just an absence that stretched wider and wider, consuming everything familiar. I started keeping a journal, writing down every sound, every shadow, every strange sensation I noticed on Willow Lane. I noted the times I saw fleeting figures in windows, the doors that moved slightly as though someone had brushed past them, the whispering that seemed to come from nowhere, The journal became a lifeline, a way to capture what might otherwise slip into the void. But even as I wrote, I felt the futility pressing against me. Documentation doesn't protect you. Observation doesn't prevent the unexplainable. One night, I walked past number 14 and noticed something that made my stomach turn. The curtains in the living room had shifted. They weren't fully drawn, but slightly parted. And behind them, a shape stood, not a child, not fully human, but tall enough to stretch, long limbs pressed against the glass. I froze, heart hammering, unable to look away. The shape didn't move, didn't make a sound, just waited. And then, as I blinked, it was gone. But the image stayed burned in my mind. I've walked that street countless times since, but the image never leaves. I try to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a trick of grief, a trick of imagination. But deep down, I know what I saw. And I know what I feel whenever I pass number 14. The sense that the absence isn't empty. That something has filled the space Katie left behind. Something patient. Something watching. It's the not knowing that's the worst. The questions that have no answers. Did she get taken? Did she run and find safety? Or is she still there, trapped in some corner of that street, moving just out of sight? The possibility of never knowing gnaws at me. Sometimes I imagine her voice in the wind, faint and mournful, a reminder that Willow Lane keeps its secrets and gives nothing in return. I've started avoiding the street after dark. The shadows feel too long, too thick, the air too heavy. But the whispers follow me anyway, curling around my apartment like smoke. I hear the faint creak of a floorboard that isn't mine, a soft brush against the walls. Sometimes I wake to the sensation of eyes on me, though no one is there. I can't escape Willow Lane. Even when I'm away, in other parts of the town, I carry the weight of that street with me. Katie's absence has changed me. I'm more aware of the spaces between houses, the dark corners behind curtains, the way shadows bend unnaturally. I notice the silence in places where there should be sound, the sudden movement at the edge of vision, and always I feel the gaze, watching, waiting, a reminder that the street isn't done with me, and maybe it's not done with her either. I sometimes dream I find her. I see her bike leaning against the porch, untouched, and she's there, looking at me with eyes too old, too knowing for a child. And then she's gone. The dream ends in darkness. I wake gasping, unable to shake the sense that something has followed me from the dream into the real world. I've learned to live with it, or at least I try. The street hasn't claimed me, not fully, but every night. I wonder what would have happened if I had been braver, if I had entered the house sooner, if I had stayed when I first heard her voice. The weight of those questions never leaves. Willow Lane keeps its secrets well, and I am left with only fragments. The empty bike, the footprints in dust, the whispers in the wind. And maybe that's the cruelest part. Not the shadows, not the shapes, not even the whispers. It's the not knowing, the certainty that Katie may never be found, that the street, the house, the air itself holds her absence like a prize, and no one will ever understand what happened. That knowledge lingers like smoke, seeping into your chest, twisting around your ribs, until you feel hollow, haunted, and forever uncertain. I walk past number 14 now with my head down, trying not to feel too much, but it's always there in the corner of my vision, in the spaces I can't fill, in the silence that isn't empty. Willow Lane waits, and I know, even if I never step foot on that street again, I will carry it with me. The disappearance may have ended, or it may not have, but the haunting, the slow, creeping dread will never leave. I pulled into the parking lot of the motel late, just past midnight, the engine of my car echoing against the cracked asphalt. The place looked tired, like it had been scraped together from faded paint and concrete, with a flickering neon sign that buzzed more than it glowed. I had a long drive behind me, and nowhere else to go, and something about the emptiness of the lot made me uneasy, but I told myself I was just tired. It was nothing more than that. The office was dimly lit, fluorescent bulbs casting a harsh white over the counter. Behind it, a man with thin, greasy hair looked up from a ledger, his eyes narrowing as if I had just interrupted something private. "Room?" he asked, voice rough. I nodded, muttering, "One night." He thumbed to the register, paused, and then leaned forward. "Room 9. That's all I got left. I hadn't noticed a room number at first, but as he handed me the key, I saw it scratched faintly into the wood of the desk. The 9 was deep, uneven, as if someone had pressed too hard with a knife. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the motel was just old. I thanked him and climbed into my car, the key heavy in my palm. The hallways smelled of bleach mixed with something sour and metallic, the kind of smell that lingers in your nose longer than it should. Room 9 was at the far end of the corridor. The door paint chipped and edges framed like it had been opened thousands of times by hands that didn't care. I paused for a moment before turning the knob, feeling the cold metal bite into my fingers. Inside, the room was small, barely enough space of bed and a desk. But the sheets were clean and the bathroom looked functional. I dropped my bag, letting it thud against the floor, and sank onto the bed. The room was silent in a way that made the air feel thick. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself the quiet was normal this late at night. But as I glanced around, I noticed something strange. There were scratches on the door frame, deep, uneven lines, not the kind you get from nails accidentally scraping against wood. They were deliberate, like someone had tried to claw their way out, or perhaps mark something. I ran my fingers along them, the grooves rough and jagged. My skin prickled. I couldn't place why, but the markings felt alive, as if they remembered someone touching them, as if they had absorbed every hand, every finger that had pressed there before mine. The feeling of being watched hit me then, sudden and sharp, a pulse in the back of my neck. I told myself it was paranoia, fatigue from the long drive, or maybe just the eerie appearance of a motel, but the unease didn't fade. I moved to the window and looked out at the parking lot. The neon sign buzz flickered, and the shadows of the cars stretched in odd angles, twisted by the light. Nothing moved, but the silence made it feel like the lot was breathing. I tried to distract myself. I pulled out my laptop, checked emails, scrolled through the news, but the screen felt intrusive, too bright for quiet around me. I kept glancing at the door. Every small sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the faint rustle of the curtains, made my stomach tighten. Then I saw it. Something etched lightly into the wooden headboard of the bed. A series of scratches, symbols almost jagged and uneven. I ran my fingers along them, tracing the lines, but couldn't make sense of them. It looked like a code, a message, a warning perhaps. The air in the room grew heavier. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that the room was old, that it had a history like all these motels do, but the markings were too fresh, too deliberate. And then I heard it, a faint noise, almost like scratching, coming from the corner of the room behind the bed. I froze. My heart kicked against my ribs. I leaned closer, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I couldn't explain why, but I felt the need to touch the wall, to press my palm against the plaster. My hand was cold almost instantly, as if the wall had absorbed the chill from the shadows themselves. Goosebumps rose along my arms. The silence returned, heavier this time, like a weight pressing down from the corners of the ceiling. I sat back on the bed, trying to make sense of it, but the uneasy feeling remained. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tried lying flat, closing my eyes, convincing myself it was all just my imagination, but the scratches on the doorframe and headboard haunted me. I could almost hear faint murmurs when I closed my eyes, indistinct, carried by the shadows. Every time I tried to dismiss them, the noises grew sharper, clearer, more deliberate. The air seemed to press in, tightening around my chest, around my throat, making each breath shallow. At some point, I heard a soft tap against the window. My eyes snapped open, and I sat rigid on the bed. The room was empty. The parking lot outside was silent. The neon light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. I could almost imagine a figure standing there, watching. My mind tried to rationalize it. The reflection of the headboard, a branch tapping against the glass. But instinct screamed at me to leave. I didn't. I stayed until the first hints of dawn, watching the shadows in the corners stretch and shrink with a flickering neon. The scratching in the door frame and the symbols in the headboard kept my attention, their meaning just out of reach, teasing my brain like they knew I was searching for answers I couldn't understand. I ran my fingers over the grooves one last time, try to memorize their shape, their texture, the way they caught the light. Even with the sun rising, the room felt heavy. I packed my things slowly, every movement deliberate, conscious of the way my hands trembled. The hallway smelled of the same sour bleach, but in the daylight it felt different, less oppressive, yet still strange, as though the building had a memory of the night that hadn't fully faded. The receptionist glanced up as I handed back the key, saying nothing about the scratches on the desk or the heavy air in the room. I nodded, thanked him, and left, driving away. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been observing me, cataloging me, noting each tremor of my hand, each step I took. The scratches, the markings, the taps, the whispers in the dark, they clung to me, tucked themselves into my memory, like the motel had imprinted a part of itself on my mind. I tried to tell myself I would forget, that I would never return, but the unease burrowed deep, lingering long after the neon sign faded behind me, flickering in the distance like a warning. Even now, days later, I think about room 9. I remember the grooves in the doorframe, the symbols on the headboard, and the heavy silence that seemed almost alive. Every time I close my eyes, I see the shadows stretching in corners, hear the faintest scrape along walls that should be empty. The motel, the room, the scratches. They're a puzzle I cannot solve, a presence I cannot shake, and a memory that refuses to fade. Room 9 isn't just a room. It's a space that remembers. And if you're tired enough, or alone enough, or careless enough, I think it reaches out. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it cares. But I know it's waiting, watching, and marking everyone who dares to enter, leaving them with questions they will never fully answer. And I can't stop thinking about going back. I didn't sleep well the first night in room 9, but I thought it was just the unfamiliar mattress and the hum of the old air conditioner. By the second night, I realized it was something else, something deliberate, something alive. It started softly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the scratching of fingernails over paper. I woke around 2 in the morning, heart hammering, and froze. The room was dark except for the dim glow of the neon sign outside, flickering across the cracked wallpaper. My ears strained to catch the noise again. There it was, a soft, persistent tapping coming from the wall nearest the headboard, the one with the carved symbols I had traced with my fingers when I first arrived. I pressed my hand to my ear, listening. Tap, tap, pause tap. Uneven, irregular, as if whoever or whatever was making it couldn't keep a steady rhythm. My mind tried to reason. Maybe the building was settling, maybe the pipes were shifting. But the sound had a tone that made my stomach tighten, a deliberate quality that no ordinary creak or groan could replicate. I sat up slowly, holding my breath, trying to catch any other sign. The room smelled faintly of the same metallic tang I had noticed the first night, like iron and dust mixed together, and every inhale seemed to pull the scent deeper into my lungs. The tapping continued, moving slightly, shifting along the wall. I felt it in my chest, the pressure of it, the awareness that something unseen was close. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, letting its beam scan the walls. The scratches and symbols I'd seen before looked the same in the light. But for a moment, I thought I saw a faint movement beneath the surface and plaster. A shadow flickered, impossible to pin down, and I blinked rapidly, convincing myself it was a trick of the light. But instinct screamed that it was more than that. The sound grew louder. It was no longer tapping randomly. It followed a rhythm, slow and careful, as if someone were pacing behind the wall, measuring each step. I pressed my ear closer to the surface, try to hear, try and catch a pattern, but it was maddeningly elusive. The wall didn't sound solid. It seemed hollow, almost like it was breathing, expanding and contracting with each tap. I imagined hands moving under the plaster, fingernails scraping, scratching, leaving marks invisible to the eye, but etched into the memory of the room itself. I tried to sleep again, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Sometimes a soft whisper seemed to follow it, almost inaudible, like breath brushing across the edge of perception. My mind began to twist the sound into words. Help! Please don't leave. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear the walls down and see what lay behind them. But something deeper held me back, a part of me that feared the answer even more than the question. By the third night, I was unraveling. I spent hours sitting on the bed, flashlight in hand, tracing the scratches on a headboard, the deep grooves in the door frame, and the faint, almost invisible marks on the wall where the tapping seemed strongest. I began to notice patterns, small details that might have been meaningless but felt deliberate, tiny dents in plaster, scratches forming jagged lines, shapes that almost looked like letters if I tilted my head just so. I thought about the history of the motel, the faded sign out front, the peeling paint, the sagging roof. It all suggested decades of neglect, but what if neglect was just a cover? What if something had happened here, long before I arrived, that left a mark, a memory embedded in the walls? I tried searching online, but the motel had no history, no records of incidents, no old news clippings, nothing. And the receptionist, he wouldn't talk beyond the basics, his eyes flicking away when I asked too many questions. That night, around 1:30 a.m., I heard a noise behind me, not at the wall, but from the corner of the room near the door, a soft, shuffling sound, like fabric scraping against wood. I turned slowly. Nothing, but I swear the air shifted, thickening like it had weight. My breath came shallow fast, and I couldn't stop my eyes from darting around the room, following every shadow. I told myself it was fatigue, the stress of travel, maybe even my imagination, but the fear twisting in my gut told me otherwise. Then the tapping returned, louder, more insistent. And this time it was joined by a faint scratching, a drag of something sharp across the surface of the wall. It moved in a pattern now, deliberate, almost like it was circling me, surrounding me, reminding me that the room had a memory, and I was an intruder in it. I pressed my hands to the bed, fingers digging into the sheets, trying to ground myself. I wanted to believe it was a rat, a loose pipe, anything, but the rhythm, the persistence, the intelligence behind it, it wasn't natural. I thought about leaving, driving all night to somewhere else, anywhere else, but my curiosity, the same thing that always draws people danger, kept me rooted. I wanted to see it, to understand it, even if understanding meant confirming the worst fears my mind could conjure. I began speaking aloud, softly, asking questions into the darkness. Who's there? I whispered. What do you want? My own voice felt strange, foreign in the thick, silent room, and for a moment, the scratching stopped. I froze, hard in my throat, listening. Then it started again, but closer. It was no longer behind the wall. It was inside the room, moving under the surface of floorboards. I could feel it as much as hear it, vibrations crawling up my legs, up my spine. I wanted to run, but my body refused. I wanted to look, to turn, but something held my head down, eyes wide, heart hammering against my ribs. It circled, a presence I couldn't define, a weight pressing against the edges of reality. I spent hours at night awake, tracing the shapes and the dust on the floor, the scratches on the furniture and the faint letters in the wall. My hands shook constantly, every nerve on fire, and still the sound persisted, a constant reminder that the room was alive, that it remembered, that it was waiting. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I thought I could hear words forming in the scratching. Not clear, but recognizable. Don't leave, come back. My imagination? I told myself yes. But the tone, the urgency, the patience felt too real to dismiss. By morning, I was exhausted, pale, shaking. I didn't leave immediately, fearing the outside world as much as the room itself. The sunlight streaming through the window didn't comfort me. It revealed the scratches more clearly, their jagged edges almost pleading, their shapes shifting in my mind each time I blinked. I checked the corners, the ceiling, the floorboards. Everything was the same, but I could still feel the room's memory pressing against me, watching, waiting for me to return. The next night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the edge of the bed, flashlight sweeping the walls, listening to the tapping, the scratching, the whispers. I tried recording the sounds on my phone, hoping to prove to myself I wasn't imagining it. But when I played it back, all I could hear was static. The room had erased its voice from my devices, leaving only my own panic and the echoing memory of what I had heard. I started noticing subtle changes too. The scratches seemed fresher, sharper, as if someone or something had come while I wasn't looking. The air felt thicker in certain spots, colder in others. The shadows stretched differently than before, and sometimes, just out corner of my eye, I could see shapes shifting. Not fully formed, not human, but there, watching, waiting, always waiting. I realized then that room 9 had a history I couldn't uncover. The motel's records, the internet, the receptionist, all empty. It was as if the room had been waiting for me, or for someone like me, for years. I thought about who had stayed here before, what they might have heard, what they might have felt. And I wondered, had they left, or had they become part of it? Their fear and memory embedded in the walls, their presence lingering just beneath the surface? By the 4th night, I could no longer ignore the taps, the scratches, the whispers. I stopped trying to sleep, stopped trying to rationalize. I sat in the dark, listening, feeling the room's memory, letting it surround me. I spoke aloud, asking questions, pleading for answers, though I knew none would come. The room didn't answer in words. It answered in pressure, in sound, in the way the air shifted when I moved. It answered in the slow, creeping dread that settled into my bones. I don't know if I'll ever understand what lives in room 9, or why it remembers so vividly, or if it even thinks in terms of memory and time. All I know is that it's alive in a way that humans aren't. It knows when you notice it. It knows when you listen. And once it has your attention, it doesn't let go. And I can feel it now, even in the daylight. I can feel the memory of that room pressing against me, waiting for the night, waiting for the darkness, waiting for me to return. By the 3rd night in room 9, I had stopped trying to sleep. The scratching in the walls, the faint taps, the shifting shadows, they had become constant companions. I felt the room breathe around me, and I could no longer convince myself it was merely old plumbing or the wind rattling through the shutters. Something else lived here, something that remembered. I started asking questions, quiet ones, muttered under my breath while tracing the scratches in the doorframe. Questions about the motel, the room, the guests who had stayed before me. I tried to approach the receptionist, but he gave nothing beyond the standard responses. Room 9 has always been rented. Nothing special. His eyes flicked past me whenever I asked more. I realized then that he knew. He had to know. But some truths are never spoken aloud in places like this. One evening, I found myself digging through the old directory tucked behind the counter. Faded cards, brittle with age, names and dates written in neat cursive, some with check marks, others with little notes in pencil. Extended stay, did not return, left without explanation. My stomach knotted. I had never seen anything like this. Guests disappearing. Not checked out, not moved on, just gone. Room 9 had been their last stop. The entry stretched back decades. Some names I recognized from small-town obituaries. Others entirely forgotten by anyone who might have known them. The realization pressed on me, heavier than the thickest pillow on the bed. Each person had come to stay, had checked in, and then vanished. And now I was here. I wanted to laugh at myself for thinking it was coincidence. But I couldn't. The room, the scratches, the whispers, they weren't random. They were deliberate. And I had begun to feel like I was being measured, cataloged, like the room itself was counting the nights I had spent under its ceiling. I spent the night sitting on the edge of bed, notebook in hand, try to record every detail, every creak, every shifting shadow, every tap on the wall. The air felt dense, thick with memory, almost tasting of iron and dust. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than the room should allow, curling around the corners and furniture, and sometimes, just sometimes, I thought I saw something standing in them, just out of reach, observing. I would blink and it would be gone, leaving only the sense of being watched, a presence I couldn't shake. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed a pattern in the sounds. The scratching, the taps, sometimes even soft thumps on the floor. They weren't random. They followed a rhythm, a kind of sequence that I couldn't yet decipher. I began tapping along with it lightly on the edge of the desk, a foolish attempt to communicate, to see if the room would respond. And it did. The taps changed slightly, faster, slower, as if acknowledging me. I could almost feel intelligence behind them, a waiting, a deliberate attention. I thought about the other guests, the ones who never left, I tried to picture them here in the room with me. The way I could feel the room pressing against my skin, the way the air felt alive around the edges. I imagined a man, decades ago, sitting in the same chair, listening to the same taps, the same whispers. Maybe he had tried to leave. Maybe he had screamed into the night. But the room doesn't release. It only collects, remembers, and waits. I tried researching again, late into the evening, scouring the internet, old newspapers, police records. Anything that might explain why this room had so many unaccounted for guests. I found small mentions of missing people in the town, files that had been quietly archived, barely noted. Some were never found. Others were found weeks later in unrecognizable states, far from here. And almost all of them had spent a night or several in this motel before disappearing. The room had a history I couldn't deny. Sleep became impossible. I stopped trying to close my eyes, fearing that if I did, I would see them, the previous guests. Shadows at the corners, watching, reaching, their presence folded into the very walls. Sometimes I felt their weight on the bed beside me, a pressure, a coldness, as if they had been there all along, lingering. And yet when I opened my eyes, the room appeared empty, as it had always appeared, silent, still. But the silence was not absence. It was presence. It was memory. The taps became more insistent. I could hear them behind the headboard now, beneath the floorboards, through the walls that should have been solid and unyielding. I tried to call the front desk, but the line was dead. The receptionist had left long ago, leaving me alone with the room, and it seemed to celebrate my isolation, heightening its presence, reminding me that I was alone. Or perhaps I wasn't. I couldn't tell. I began noticing small changes in the room. The scratches on the headboard seemed deeper. The symbols along the doorframe looked sharper, more recent, as if the room had been marking me while I slept, leaving evidence of its watchfulness. I started talking to it, quietly at first, then louder, asking questions, pleading, demanding. "Who are you?" I whispered one night. "What do you want?" The response came not in words, but in rhythm, in movement, in the taps that pulsed through the walls. Not random, but deliberate. I felt acknowledged, and the fear tightened around my chest. I began imagining the previous guests more vividly. I could see them sitting here, restless, aware, trapped. Some would have felt terror, some confusion, some the same curiosity that had brought me here. And then, eventually, silence, complete absence. The room had claimed them, and now it was mine to experience. I wondered if I would vanish, too, if I would become another imprint, another memory etched into the walls. I tried to leave once, packing my things in haste, but the room seemed to resist. My hands trembled as I gathered my bag. The door felt heavier than it should, the handle colder, the scratches on the frame almost resisting my touch. I could feel something pressing behind it, waiting, and I couldn't open the door fast enough. When I finally stepped into the hall, it felt narrower, longer, like a corridor stretching endlessly, prolonging my exposure. The air smelled the same, but somehow thicker, darker, as if the room's memory clung to me, refusing to let go. I returned that night. I don't know why. Some part of me was compelled, drawn back by the weight of the history, the rhythm, the presence. I entered room 9 and felt it immediately. The memory, the awareness, the deliberate watching. I could almost see the shapes of the guests who had come before me, lingering in the corners, just beyond the reach of my perception. They were silent, patient, aware, and I realized with a sudden sickening clarity that I was no longer entirely alone. The taps began immediately as I sat down on the bed, soft at first, then gaining confidence. I traced the scratches along the headboard and the symbols on the doorframe, feeling the room pulse beneath my fingers. I whispered into the darkness, asking the questions I had been avoiding. Why? Who? How? The response came not in words, but in rhythm, in the subtle vibrations that shook the bed, in the cold that crept along my spine. I could feel it then, fully, the presence of the room, alive with memory, full of guests who had never left, each one folded into the walls, into the air, into the very fabric of the space. And I understood, finally, that there was no escape, no leaving without leaving a part of yourself behind. The room did not merely house guests. It absorbed them, cataloged them, remembered them, and waited for the next one who dared to enter. I don't know if I'll ever leave. I don't know if I'll become part of the room's memory, part of its rhythm, another guest who never left. All I know is that the weight of those who came before me presses on my chest, sits at the edges of my vision, whispers at the corners of my mind. Room 9 is not just a room. It's a vessel, a collector, a memory that never fades. And I understand now why the receptionist wouldn't talk, why the records are silent, why the motel looks ordinary in the daylight. Because the room exists outside of explanation. It doesn't need witnesses. It only needs guests. And I am here. I never thought I'd take a night shift at a cemetery. Not this one. The kind of place that feels like it remembers you before you even arrive. The gate squeaked as I pushed it open, echoing into the dark like a warning. The air was colder than it should have been for October, and the fog clung to the ground in thick, shivering layers. It smelled faintly of damp earth and something else, something metallic that made my stomach twist. They told me it would be quiet, easy, watch over the graves, keep vandals away, but quiet doesn't mean safe. Quiet doesn't mean empty. The cemetery stretched out farther than I'd imagined, a maze of stone markers and mausoleums. Some were cracked, leaning like old men in pain. Others were perfectly polished, as though the owners had refused to let time touch them at all. I walked between the rows, my boots crunching over dead leaves, try to convince myself I wasn't already being watched. The caretaker had given me the rules in a monotone voice, like he was reciting prayers he didn't believe in. Stay near the office unless you're checking the grounds. Don't touch anything. Don't wander off the paths. And whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers. Whispers. I laughed at that the first hour. The wind rustling through the trees sounded like voices, so I shook my head and muttered, yeah, right, whispers, ghost stories. But the more I walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, and I started hearing them. Faint at first, like the susurration of leaves brushing against each other, but then words began to form. Not clearly, not in a language I could place, just syllables that slid over the edges of my mind, testing me, brushing against memories I didn't even know I had. I stopped at an old grave near the far edge of the yard. Its stone was jagged, broken, like someone tried to erase it. The name was worn away, only faint scratches left. I crouched, brushing the dirt with my fingers, and I swear I felt a pulse beneath my palm, not in the earth, inside it, beneath it, something alive, or once alive, that wanted to be remembered. I shook my head and stood up. My flashlight trembled in my hand, and the beam caught the edge of another tombstone. Something moved. Just a shadow, I told myself. The branches? Maybe, but it moved wrong. Too deliberate. And then I realized it wasn't alone. Every few steps, a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, vanishing when I turned. I tried to keep calm, walking back toward the office. I kept my head down, focusing on the map of the cemetery they'd given me. But the fog had thickened. It felt like walking through soup. I swear I heard someone breathing behind me. Heavy, ragged. And when I spun around, there was nothing. Only the fog, swallowing the shapes of stones and the silhouettes of trees. I don't know why I went toward the old chapel. I wasn't supposed to. I knew it, but something pulled me. Curiosity, maybe, or fear, or that stupid human need to see what you're not supposed to. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it. Inside, the air was warmer, almost suffocating. Candles flickered though I hadn't brought any. Shadows leapt along the walls, alive in a way that made me step back. And then I smelled it, the faint perfume of someone or something that shouldn't exist. A sweetness that made my head spin. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was like the shadows had hooked onto my bones. And then I heard it, clear this time, a voice soft hissing. My name. I don't even remember responding, only that I whispered back, though my throat felt tight, as though I'd swallowed dust. Who's there? The shadows didn't answer. They didn't move. And yet, I knew they were circling me. I could hear it in the subtle scraping, in the soft pressure against my skin, like hundreds of tiny hands brushing my arms. I stumbled back outside, gasping, The night air hit me like ice, and the whispers followed, fading but not gone. I told myself it was nerves, stress, a trick of the wind. But the stories I'd laughed at earlier started creeping back. About the graveyard at night, about the caretaker's warning, about the lost souls who lingered when the living forgot them. I made my way toward the small office, the one building with light spilling from the windows. But the fog twisted now, like it was alive, forming shapes that weren't there before. Faces, mouths opening and closing, silent screams frozen in the mist. I blinked and they were gone. I cursed myself for seeing things that weren't real, but the memory of them clung to my chest heavy, like the weight of a coffin lid. The office was empty. The caretaker was supposed to be here, monitoring me, but no one, only the humming of the old fluorescent lights and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I slumped into the chair behind the desk, fingers clutching the edge. My flashlight sat on the desk, casting a cone of weak light into the dark corners. That's when I saw it. A small, neat row of footprints in the dust behind me. Not mine, not human. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a fox or a stray cat. But the prints were too precise, too deliberate. And then I felt it. The brush of cold against my neck, not wind, not air. Something there, waiting, watching, judging. I spent the next hour pretending to be busy. I flipped through a ledger, checked the map, wrote nonsense notes. Anything to keep my mind from unraveling. But the cemetery outside wasn't silent anymore. Whispers grew louder, swirling in the fog. Stones shifted when I wasn't looking. And sometimes I could swear the shadows formed shapes. Thin, tall figures standing over graves, bowing their heads as if in prayer. I kept thinking of the caretaker's words. Don't listen to the whispers. But how could I not? They were everywhere, rising from the ground, curling around the trees, floating in the fog like smoke from some ancient fire. They didn't speak in voices. They spoke in memories. My memories, twisted, dark fragments of moments I didn't want to remember. I saw my father, my childhood dog, my first real loss, all distorted, crying out for attention, for acknowledgement. I wanted to leave. God, I wanted to run to the fog and escape this place. But my car wasn't here. My keys weren't in my pocket. And every path I thought I knew led me deeper into the twisting rows of graves. The cemetery had changed. It wasn't just land with stones anymore. It was a maze, a living organism that swallowed me inch by inch, whisper by whisper. I finally realized the worst part. It wasn't the shadows. It wasn't the fog. It wasn't even the whispers. It was knowing that the dead were watching me. Not as spirits, not as ghosts, but as memories of themselves, as echoes of lives that had been forgotten, clawing to be remembered, clawing to make me stay. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, I found myself back at the main gate. My legs ached, my skin crawled, and my mind felt frayed at the edges. The fog lifted slowly, revealing the cemetery as it had been, ordinary and silent. I swore I saw no footprints, no shadows, no signs of the night's horrors. Only the stones, cold and indifferent. I left my flashlight on the gate. I couldn't bring it inside the car. I couldn't bring it home. And as I drove away, the whispers followed me just beyond hearing, curling around my skull, reminding me that they hadn't finished, that the cemetery didn't forget, and I would have to come back, because it wasn't just a job. It was a binding, and the dead don't let go. I woke before midnight, even though I hadn't slept more than a few restless hours. The cemetery was quieter than before, almost expectant, like it had been holding its breath for me. I pulled on my jacket, the fabric stiff and damp from the chill that never seemed to leave the grounds, and stepped out. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but the beam felt feeble, as if it could barely keep the shadows at bay. That's when I noticed the mist. Thick, curling, moving in ways it shouldn't. Not like morning fog that drifts lazily across the ground, but like something alive. It slithered around tombstones, climbing their edges, pooling in corners, retreating when I stepped too close. And it wasn't just in front of me. It moved from every direction at once, like the cemetery itself was breathing. I tried to shake off the unease. Fog doesn't have intentions. It doesn't watch. but I felt eyes on me anyway. I felt the weight of something unseen, pressing just beyond the light. I walked slowly down a narrow path between two older sections, the mist thickened around me, and then I saw it, a figure, standing perfectly still behind a tall obelisk. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just existed. My heart thumped so loudly I could hear it echoing in my ears. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. Hello? Nothing. I stepped forward, trying to get a better look, and then it vanished. Not like it ran away, not like it faded, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. My stomach turned over. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but the space it had occupied felt wrong, distorted, warped. I kept moving, forcing myself along the paths, my boots crunching over leaves and dirt that didn't want to be disturbed. The fog shifted with me, curling at my ankles, brushing against my hands like fingers. And then I saw more figures. They appeared in the distance, between stones, leaning over graves, staring at me with empty faces I couldn't quite make out. Each time I approached, each time I tried to step closer, they dissolved into mist, leaving only the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic. I stopped and leaned against a weathered tombstone, my chest heaving. I tried to remind myself that it was just exhaustion, just imagination, but my mind kept circling back to the first figure. The way it felt real, too real, like it had been waiting for me. I remembered what the caretaker had said about the cemetery at night, about the dead not being content to lie quietly. I'd laughed it off, but now I wasn't laughing, not even a little. I forced myself forward, taking careful steps. The mist was thicker here, wrapping around the graves like it had weight, like it had intention. I felt it pressing against my skin, cold and wet, crawling along my arms and neck. And I knew it wasn't the fog that scared me, it was what it carried. A whisper, soft and low, drifted through the mist. I couldn't make out the words at first, only a sound that reminded me of wind through hollow branches. And then I did. My name, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was savoring the sound. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The mist parted just enough for me to see a figure leaning against a broken headstone. The features were obscured, but the posture was familiar, too familiar. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape, but my body refused. I thought about the nights when I was a child, alone in my room, listening to the wind rattle the windows. I thought about the times I'd woken to shadows in corners, faces pressed against glass, memories that weren't mine, but felt like they should be. And suddenly, the figure stepped forward, not quickly, not violently, but with a slow inevitability that made my chest tighten. Then it disappeared again. I stumbled, gripping the edge of a grave for support. The mist was swirling faster now, thick like smoke, blotting out everything beyond a few feet. I could hear faint sounds, footsteps, breathing, or maybe echoes of something long gone. Each time I tried to move toward a figure, it vanished. Each time I tried to leave, the mist seemed to stretch, closing paths I had just walked. I realized then that the cemetery wasn't just a place. It was alive. It breathed. It watched. It remembered. Every step I took, the mist twisted around me, guiding me, testing me, keeping me exactly where it wanted. I rounded a small mausoleum, and my flashlight caught another figure. This one was sitting on the stone steps, hands folded, head bowed. I called out again, voice hoarse. "Who are you?" The head lifted slowly. I froze. The face was blurred, but the eyes, they were mine. Not exactly mine, but a reflection, distorted, twisted, a version of me that belonged to this place, not of the world I thought I knew. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, and when I looked again, the figure had melted into the mist. I ran then, not with purpose, not toward anything, just away from the shapes, away from the whispers, away from myself. The fog followed, curling around my legs, tugging at my jacket, wrapping me in cold and wet. The voices rose, overlapping now, murmuring fragments of sentences I couldn't understand but somehow knew. I heard my mother's voice, my father's, friends I'd lost long ago, all woven together in a chorus that twisted my stomach. I skidded to a halt at a clearing, gasping. The mist was thinning here, but I could see them, figures everywhere, standing still, kneeling, lying over graves. And they were all looking at me, waiting, expecting, judging. I could see the shape of my own fear mirrored in every shadow. I forced myself to breathe, trying to think. I had to remember the path back. I had to leave. But the cemetery didn't want me to. Every turn I tried led me deeper. Every step forward brought more figures. I couldn't tell the living from the dead, the real from the reflection. It was all mist, all shadow, all memory. I thought of the caretaker again. What had he meant? Don't listen. But I could not listen. They spoke to me, and in their voices were fragments of myself I'd tried to bury, things I hadn't dared to face. And now, they were here, laid bare among the stones, daring me to remember. I stumbled into a small cluster of graves, tripping over roots and uneven earth. My flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed me completely. I could feel them then, not just see them. The mist pressed closer, wrapping me, lifting my hair from my neck, tugging at my clothes. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, tight, unyielding. And then I saw it, a faint glow, low and flickering, emanating from somewhere deep in the fog. I moved toward it, unsure if it was salvation or another trap. The light danced just beyond reach, teasing me, pulling me forward, and in the distance, I glimpsed the outlines of figures, standing as still as statues, watching me approach. I wanted to turn back. I wanted to run and never return. But the light drew me closer, and with every step, the figures multiplied, appearing at the edges of my vision, dissolving when I focused on them. My mind ached from trying to comprehend them, from trying to hold on to my own reality in the swirling nightmare. Finally, I reached the source, a small lantern, hanging from a wrought iron post, swinging lightly though no wind touched it. The light cast long shadows. In those shadows, I thought I saw faces, old, young, familiar, forgotten. They stared at me silently, holding me in place. And for the first time, I understood the mist, the figures, the whispers. They weren't here to scare me. They were here to be seen, to be remembered. Each shadow, each echo, each flicker of light carried a life, a memory, a story that had been buried under stone and soil. And now they were awake, moving through the fog, waiting for someone to acknowledge them. I dropped to my knees, exhausted, terrified, and whispered apologies into the damp air. I didn't know if anyone or anything was listening, but it felt necessary. I had to recognize them, had to see them, had to survive the night by facing what had been hidden in the mist. The fog began to recede slowly, curling away from me, returned to graves as if satisfied that I had seen. The figures melted back into the shadows, and the night quieted, though it remained heavy, expectant. My flashlight flickered back to life, casting its weak beam across the clearing. The lantern swung gently, light steady now, and I realized I had made it through. But the cemetery didn't forget. Not really. Not ever. And as I walked back to the office, my boots sinking into the cold, wet earth, I knew I would return. Not because I wanted to, but because the mist, the shadows, the whispers, they were still here. And they remembered me. I didn't sleep again. Not really. The memory of the mist and the figures haunted me, curling around my skull, gnawing at my thoughts. I felt the weight of the cemetery even before I stepped through the gate. The cold air settling into my bones, the fog creeping along the paths like it had learned to wait for me. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the shapes I'd seen, the whispers I'd heard, were just tricks of tired eyes and an overworked mind. But something had changed, something in the soil itself. And tonight, I could feel it, heavier than ever. I started my shift by checking the graves I'd walked past the night before. My flashlight beam swept across the cold stones, lingering on each name, each date, and something felt off. The ground looked different, freshly disturbed. Small shifts in the dirt, marks of movement. I froze. My hand hovered over the flashlight as I crouched beside one of the graves. The soil was loose, too loose, and there were prints, barely there, but enough to suggest someone or something had been there recently. My stomach turned. The caretaker hadn't mentioned anyone being in the cemetery at night besides me, and yet these signs were undeniable. I followed the trail of disturbed earth, my mind racing. The marks led me from one grave to another, scattered across the older section of the yard. Coffins that should have been sealed were cracked, lids askew. The air smelled sharper here, metallic, the scent of rusted iron and wet wood. My hands shook as I ran them over one coffin's edge. It was empty, cold, and it felt waiting. I stumbled back, heart hammering. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe grave robbers, maybe animals, but the careful way the soil had been moved, the precision of the disturbance, it didn't feel like animals, and humans wouldn't leave empty coffins behind. Not like this, not in the middle of the night. I took a step back, wiping sweat from my brow. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw a hand, pale, thin, almost translucent, curling from the nearest open coffin. I blinked and it was gone. Just the lid again, slightly ajar, silent. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself I had to investigate, had to understand what was happening. The cemetery was alive with sound now, not whispers this time, but faint scratching, like nails dragging over wood and stone. The shadows of the tombstones seemed to lean toward me, reaching, watching. I came to a mausoleum I hadn't noticed before. Small, brick-lined, its door partially open. Inside, the air was colder, dense, as if the temperature itself feared movement. I shone my flashlight around, and the beam caught something that made my stomach seize. Inside, every coffin lid had been shifted. Some were cracked, others had completely disappeared, leaving empty spaces in the stone niches. I swallowed hard. The silence pressed against me. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and ragged. And then, faintly, I heard it, a dragging sound, low and slow, coming from somewhere deeper in the mausoleum. My pulse raced. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt frozen. My mind kept returning to the empty coffins, the disturbed soil outside, and the sense that someone or something was still moving in the shadows. I stepped closer, flashlight beam trembling across the walls. The dragging grew louder. Something shifted in the corner of the room. A figure? I couldn't tell. My heart hammered as I took another step, and then it moved, not quickly, not violently, but deliberately, slowly, and I realized it wasn't human. I stumbled back, falling against a stone wall. My flashlight swung, catching glimpses of movement. Pale hands reaching, fingers curling, brushing the edges of coffins as if they were searching. And then I understood, it wasn't just the soil, not just the missing lids. The dead themselves weren't resting. Something had disturbed them. Something had awakened them. I tried to shout, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind reeled with possibilities. Grave robbers, vandals, some cult, but none of it made sense. None of it explained the cold, the fog, the way the air seemed to thicken with every step I took. I felt eyes on me, unseen but impossible to ignore, and I realized the figures in the mausoleum weren't looking at me. They were waiting for me. I stumbled backward, bumping into a coffin. The lid shifted under my touch. Empty. My stomach lurched, and then I felt it. A cold hand brush against mine. I jerked away. The air around me seemed to hum, vibrating with a presence I could neither see nor name. I ran out of the mausoleum, not caring where I was going, only that I had to escape. The cemetery seemed to expand around me, rows of tombstones stretching endlessly, paths twisting in ways I didn't remember. Figures flickered in the mist, pale and thin, standing silently at the edges of my vision. Each time I looked directly, they vanished, leaving nothing but fog and my own terrified reflection in the shadows. I found myself back at one of the graves I'd inspected earlier. The soil was shifting again as if someone or something was moving beneath it. My heart pounded in my ears. I had to see. I had to know. Slowly, trembling, I knelt beside the grave. The dirt moved, slowly, deliberately, forming shapes beneath the surface. My hands hovered over it, shaking uncontrollably, and then I saw the fingers, pale and thin, curling toward me from below. My mind screamed. My instinct shouted at me to get away. but I was rooted to the spot. I couldn't look away. The fingers retracted and the soil settled. Silence. Only my own ragged breathing filled the air. I felt exposed, raw, as if the cemetery had peeled back the world and shown me something I wasn't meant to see, something that wasn't meant to exist in the realm of the living. I stumbled back, tripping over roots and uneven earth. My flashlight skittered across the ground, catching glimpses of figures emerging from the fog, standing silently beside graves, leaning over coffins, not moving quickly, not attacking, just observing, watching, waiting. I realized then that the disturbance in the graves wasn't the work of humans, nor was it animals. It was something else. Something that walked between life and death. Something that had been sleeping in the soil, waiting for the living to forget, waiting for someone to wander too close. I tried to force myself to leave, but the cemetery had other plans. Paths I had walked earlier twisted into new directions. Coffins appeared and disappeared in the fog, and always, just beyond sight, the figures watched, their presence a weight pressing against my chest, reminded me that I was intruding on a world I didn't belong to. I thought about the caretaker's words, about staying on the paths, about ignoring the whispers. I had failed. I had strayed. I had seen too much. And now, the cemetery demanded recognition, demanded fear, demanded that I understand the fragile line between life and what lies beneath. I reached the edge of the older section, near a row of graves I had passed countless times. One coffin lid was completely removed, lying to the side. The soil around it was turned over, footprints leading away, but fading into mist. I knelt and peered inside. Empty, but the smell, damp, metallic, alive, made my stomach twist. Something had been here, something that didn't belong to the living. I stood, hands trembling, and tried to shake myself free. But then I felt it again, a cold touch on my shoulder. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly. Nothing, just a fog curling between stones, hiding everything. I felt the presence close, pressing against me, waiting for me to acknowledge it, waiting for me to see it fully. I ran, blindly, through the twisting paths, through fog that clung to my legs and wrapped around my arms. Figures flickered at the edges of my vision, pale hands reaching, faces blurred, all of them silent, all of them watching. I stumbled over a root, fell hard, and the flashlight skidded away. Darkness swallowed me. I lay there, chest heaving, listening. The fog thickened, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and iron. And then I heard it, movement beneath the soil, shifting, dragging. My eyes, wide and unseeing, caught glimpses of shapes crawling through the mist, emerging from graves that should have been sealed. Cold hands reaching, empty coffins. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran blindly until the cemetery gate appeared through the fog. I didn't slow. I didn't look back. I crossed the threshold and kept going until the fog and the shadows stayed behind. Or so I hoped. But I know they didn't. I know the cold hands, the empty coffins, the watching figures. They remember me. They wait. And the cemetery is patient. The cemetery was quiet when I arrived, but quiet had never felt so heavy. The fog from the previous nights had thinned, leaving a damp chill that seeped into my bones. My flashlight cut weakly through the darkness, the beam trembling in my grip every time I moved. It seemed to cast more shadows than it revealed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already being watched. The first sound came from the east side, near a row of older graves. A soft, deliberate footstep. Pause. Another. Pause. I froze, my hand tightening on the flashlight. It didn't sound human. Not exactly. Too steady, too hollow. And yet it was real. I could feel it vibrating through the ground. I whispered into the dark, voice catching in my throat. Hello? Who's there? Nothing. Only silence, stretched tight across the cemetery, pressing against my ears. I moved cautiously toward the noise, my boots crunching on fallen leaves, each step louder than the last. The footfalls didn't stop. They kept coming, circling, shifting. I turned in the direction of the sound, but the fog twisted oddly around the tombstones. Nothing moved, yet the sound followed me, echoing just beyond the edges of my flashlight's reach. I stopped beside a tall marble gravestone, heart hammering, flashlight shaking. The air smelled faintly metallic, wet earth and something sharper I couldn't name. The footsteps stopped, then shifted closer. I took a cautious step forward. The stone at my feet had been disturbed. My flashlight beam swept across the ground, and I noticed something that made my stomach seize. My own notebook, the one I kept for the logs of my shifts, lay on the dirt. I hadn't brought it here yet. I bent down slowly, trying to convince myself it had been the wind, that I must have dropped it on the way past. But it wasn't like I had left it, and I was careful. I always was. The notebook was open, pages ruffled, as if someone or something had been reading it. My fingers shook as I closed it, heart hammering in my chest. Another step, closer. I whipped around, flashlight sweeping over the graves. Nothing, only fog curling between the stones. Only shadows leaning in ways they shouldn't. My mind reeled. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself. Maybe I was hearing what I wanted, or didn't want to hear. But the notebook, that was proof. Something was moving here, and it wasn't human. I kept walking, flashlight beam darting over cracked stone and twisted roots. Every few steps, I noticed things that had shifted. Small markers I had placed earlier, some flowers, even a small ceramic angel. None were where I had left them. It was subtle, almost polite, but deliberate, a presence that didn't need to be seen to be felt. I approached the far end of the cemetery. The fog was lighter here, curling around the base of a crumbling mausoleum. I froze. There, at the foot of the structure, a shovel lay across the stones. I hadn't touched it, and I was certain of that. My chest tightened. I felt a coldness wrap around my shoulders, and a whisper of movement brushed past my ear, soft and deliberate. Footsteps. I spun, flashlight trembling. Nothing. Only shadows stretching and twisting across the mausoleum wall. I called out again, louder this time, desperation creeping into my voice. Who's there? Show yourself. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, a soft scuff coming from behind the mausoleum. I stepped closer, flashlight cutting through the dark. My heart twisted in my chest. The entrance to the structure was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. Inside, the air was colder, denser. Dust hung in the beam of the flashlight, disturbed, floating in lazy swirls. And then I noticed it, objects that I hadn't moved. A flower pot knocked aside. The handle of a broom leaning in the corner, tilted forward like someone had just let go. My hand hovered over the doorframe, and I felt the brush of cold air, as if someone had exhaled across my neck. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands. The steps returned, faint, deliberate, moving in the shadows outside. They circled the mausoleum, slow, patient. Each time I peered out, there was nothing, only fog, only the distorted outlines of tombstones. I felt trapped, drawn into a game I didn't understand, and the more I tried to rationalize, the less sense it made. I thought about the caretaker's words again, about the night shift, about staying on the paths, about ignoring the whispers. I had failed. I had wandered. I had let curiosity or fear lead me, and now the cemetery was awake, moving in ways I couldn't track, shifting objects, circling me, testing me. I stepped back outside. The footsteps continued, circling through the fog. My flashlight caught glimpses of figures at the edges of the path, tall and thin, faces obscured, heads tilting as if watching my every move. When I approached, they vanished, just mist curling between the stones, leaving the air heavier, thicker, more alive. I stumbled over a root, landing hard, flashlight skittering across the ground. The beam caught something that made my stomach knot. A pair of small, worn shoes, sitting neatly beside a grave I had passed only minutes ago. I didn't recognize them. They weren't mine. They weren't adult-sized. And they hadn't been there before. I felt a cold hand on my ankle. I jerked away. Nothing. Only fog curling, pulling back, teasing. Footsteps. I could hear them circling again, slow, deliberate, echoing through the ground beneath me. I moved toward the gate, desperate for the outside, for the normal world. But every path I took seemed to twist under the weight of the night. The objects I had placed earlier, flowers, candles, small markers, were no longer where I'd left them. Some were moved closer to graves, some lined up along paths that I hadn't walked. It was subtle, meticulous, polite almost, but it was there. The presence was there, shaping the cemetery around me. I stopped at a small bench, leaning heavily against it. My mind was spinning. The footsteps continued, slow, patient, circling, never leaving, always just beyond the edge of light. I could feel them watching, waiting for me to make a mistake, to look away, to forget, to leave something behind. A sudden chill brushed my neck, a whisper in my ear. I flinched, flashlight swinging. Nothing, only fog curling like smoke. And then I realized something. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was observing, learning, waiting. Every object shifted, every footstep traced. Every shadow that vanished was part of a careful pattern, a record of my presence. I remembered nights in my childhood, waking to creaks and whispers in the dark, shadows that pressed against the walls of my room, shapes that shouldn't have existed. And now, I was back in that same terror, only larger, older, heavier, pressing down to the fog and stone. I called out one last time, voice cracking. I see you. I know you're here. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed against me. Then, slowly, faintly, a single object shifted. A flower I had placed weeks ago leaned toward me, petals brushing against the edge of my boot. And I understood. The cemetery didn't need to attack. It didn't need to reveal itself fully. It only needed to move, to exist, to remind me that it remembered, that it watched, that it was patient. I left the bench, my boots crunching over leaves and disturbed soil. Every turn I took, the fog parted and curled around me. Objects shifted slightly, figures flickering just at the edges of perception. By the time I reached the gate, dawn was beginning to stain the horizon. The fog thinned, objects returned, shadows melted. The cemetery looked normal again, silent, empty, but I knew it wasn't. Not really. Footsteps had walked with me all night, and they hadn't stopped. The objects hadn't forgotten my presence. The cemetery would wait, patient, silent, ready, and I would return, because the footsteps in the dark didn't belong to me. They belonged to something else, something older, something that remembered every visitor, every shift, every mistake, and it would follow me, even when I thought I was safe. I thought dawn would bring relief, that the rising sun would burn away the fog, dissolve the shadows, and return the cemetery to something like ordinary. I was wrong. The first rays of light spilled over the horizon, pale and weak, touching the tops of gravestones that still seemed taller, darker than they had yesterday. The air was cold, damp, but not with dew. Something else lingered, heavier, pressing against my chest, wrapping around my lungs. I tried to breathe, but it felt thick, like inhaling water instead of air. I walked the familiar paths slowly, boots crunching over leaves and broken twigs. My flashlight felt absurd in the daylight, but I carried it anyway. Habit, fear, a warning I wasn't ready to ignore. The cemetery looked empty, quiet, too quiet. The mist had vanished, the fog lifted, and yet the feeling remained. Something was watching, patient, waiting, remembering. I went to the mausoleum. The door hung slightly open, the hinges stiff. I forced my hand against it, and it creaked, echoing in the hollow space. Inside, the coffins were back in place, some still cracked, some fully sealed. Everything appeared as it should, but I knew better. My mind reminded me of the night, of cold hands, empty coffins, footsteps circling, the shadows at the edge of vision. I had seen them. I had felt them, and they hadn't forgotten me. I tried to convince myself it had been exhaustion, my eyes playing tricks, the wind shifting the fog, anything to make sense of it. But the soil, still slightly loose near several graves, told another story. Someone or something had been here recently, hadn't left, and I couldn't tell if I was safe or still in its reach. I walked between the gravestones, tracing paths I'd followed countless times. Something moved at the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting just beyond the edge of perception. I spun, but there was nothing, only the familiar rows of stones, indifferent, unfeeling. And yet I felt it, the weight of unseen eyes, the brush of a presence lingering too close. I thought about the notebook, the objects that had moved, the footsteps circling me all night. I tried to rationalize, but every attempt fell apart. The memories were too vivid, too persistent. I remembered the first figure in the fog, the way it vanished and left me trembling, the dragging sounds in the mausoleum, the open coffins, the pale hands reaching from the soil. It wasn't imagination. It couldn't have been. I forced myself to check each grave I had noted during my night shift. Small flowers I had placed weeks ago leaned awkwardly, some turned, others gone entirely. The wind hadn't done this. I hadn't done it, and no one else was here. I could feel it. The cemetery itself had moved, reshaped subtly, leaving traces of its presence behind. I remembered the caretaker's words. Stay on the paths. Ignore the whispers. Follow the rules. I had failed. I had wandered. And now, in the cold daylight, I understood the price. The cemetery didn't just watch at night. It remembered. It measured. It waited. I paused at the edge of a small clearing, where a cluster of graves formed a tight circle. The soil was loose, freshly turned. My hand shook as I knelt, brushing away dirt. Another coffin lid lay to the side. Empty. I couldn't stop staring. I wanted to scream, to call someone, anyone, but the sound caught in my throat. My mind was fraying, unraveling, collapsing under the weight of what I had seen. The sun climbed higher, washing the cemetery in pale light, and yet I felt colder than before. Shadows clung to graves, subtle, persistent, like ink seeping through stone. I realized I couldn't trust my senses. I couldn't trust my mind. I had been alone, yet I hadn't. Something had followed me, moved objects, shifted paths, circled me, and now it was here in the daylight, patient, silent, waiting for me to slip. I thought of the fog, the figures that vanished when approached, the footsteps circling. I remember the small shoes beside a grave I hadn't walked near, the cold brush against my ankle, the whispers echoing through the soil. I had touched the boundary between life and something else, and now, in the weak sun, I felt that boundary press against me still. I tried to leave. I walked toward the main gate, boots crunching over earth that seemed heavier, wetter, as though it remembered the night. The path twisted subtly, though I had walked it countless times. Every step felt watched, measured, noted. The cemetery wasn't done with me. Not yet. I reached the gate and paused. The town lay beyond, ordinary, quiet, unaware. People went about their lives, oblivious to the cemetery's patient vigilance. I wanted to leave. I wanted to forget. I wanted to believe it had been a night of fevered imagination, that the fog, the figures, the footsteps, the open coffins, they were gone, irrelevant, meaningless. But I couldn't. I glanced back once, toward the rows of gravestones. The light didn't reach the far corners. Shadows pooled in the gaps between stones. A figure, or the suggestion of one, shifted at the edge of the sunlight. I couldn't tell if it had been watching me all night, or if it had appeared just now. It didn't move closer. It didn't vanish. It just waited, patient, unyielding, immortal. I shivered. The notebook in my pocket felt heavy, like contained more than ink and paper. Memories, fragments of nights I hadn't slept, names I couldn't forget, whispers I could still hear if I concentrated. The cemetery had left its mark, and I carried it with me. I walked home slowly, boots wet, jacket damp, heart hammering. Every shadow in the street, every flicker of light seemed a part of that night. I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to warn them. But who would believe me? Who could? The evidence was subtle, almost polite. The presence didn't need to attack. It only needed to exist, to leave traces, to remind me that it watched, remembered, and waited. I reached my front door, fumbling with keys. The world inside felt fragile, like the sunlight itself was a thin curtain, barely holding back something vast and patient. I stepped in, locked the door, and tried to breathe, tried to convince myself it was over. But it wasn't. I could feel in the quiet, in the spaces between heartbeat and breath. I could feel the cemetery beyond, patient, waiting, knowing I had been there, knowing I had seen too much. I sat in my living room, notebook open, fingers tracing the lines of writing I had done over the past nights. I reread my entries, half hoping the words would make sense, half fearing they would remember me as much as I remembered them. The air felt heavy, Every shadow in the room stretched too long. Every reflection in the glass seemed just slightly wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I had left the cemetery, but the cemetery hadn't left me. Even now, hours later, the memory of cold hands, empty coffins, footsteps in the dark, and the shifting objects lingers. I can feel it in my chest, in my neck, in the space behind my eyes. It doesn't matter that the sun is up, dawn has come, but it doesn't bring comfort. It only brings the knowledge that what I experienced was real, that it followed me, and that it waits, always waits. I try to sleep, but I can hear whispers, faint, just beyond understanding. Names I don't recognize, memories that aren't mine, a presence that curves around the edges of reality. I lie awake, heart pounding, waiting for the inevitable, knowing the cemetery is patient, knowing it will not forget, knowing that my sanity is fragile, stretched thin by nights I will never forget. I will have to return. I know that the cemetery has claimed a part of me. It doesn't matter that I left the gate behind. That sunlight now touches every gravestone. It doesn't matter that the town carries on as if nothing happened. I have crossed into something older, something patient, and dawn doesn't chase it away. Dawn doesn't bring comfort. Dawn only reminds me that the dark is still there, waiting, watching, remembering. And I know, in the quietest part of the morning, that I am not safe. Not truly, not yet. The air in the factory had grown heavier since my last visit. I couldn't explain it, not logically. The smell of rust and damp concrete was still there, but beneath it was something sharper now, like the factory had absorbed more than just neglect, like it carried a memory, and that memory had turned bitter. I moved carefully through the machinery, my boots crunching over fragments of metal and glass. Every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should, bending around me in ways that made my skin crawl. The flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating rusted wheels and conveyor belts that hadn't moved in decades. And yet, I could feel the weight of eyes on me, though I saw nothing. I came to a wall near the center of the building. It was cracked, bricks exposed, paint peeling. At first, I thought it was just decay, but then I saw the marks, scratches etched into the surface, shallow but deliberate, lines intersecting, crossing, forming shapes I couldn't understand, and words, names mostly, faded, worn, scrawled in haste or desperation. I crouched closer, heart hammering. Some of the words were smudged, nearly illegible. Others were clear. Don't follow. He watches. Never leave. My stomach turned. Whoever had been here before, whoever had vanished into this factory, had left messages, warnings, please. And now, I was the one walking into them. I ran my fingers over the scratches, hesitant, as though touching them would summon whatever had left them. The grooves were deep in some places, jagged in others. The wall felt alive beneath my touch, pulsing almost imperceptibly, like a heartbeat I couldn't hear but could feel in my chest. A noise echoed across the factory floor, soft at first, then louder, a scraping sound, dragging along concrete. I froze, heart hammering. My flashlight beam darted toward the sound. Shadows twisted between machines, flitting just beyond the edges of light. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my trembling hands. The marks on the wall seemed to stretch in the dim light, connecting like constellations. I could see more names, more warnings, more desperate scratches. Some were accompanied by symbols I didn't recognize, circles, lines, shapes that seemed almost ritualistic. And then a single word stood out, repeated in several places. Alone, I whispered aloud, voice small, swallowed by the cavernous space. Alone. It echoed back at me, but not from the walls, from somewhere else, deeper, closer. My chest tightened, every nerve screaming. I told myself it was the acoustics, the emptiness of the factory, but the word lingered, weighty, deliberate, like a presence shaping the air itself. I moved along the wall, tracing the scratches. More names appeared, some crossed out, some circled. Dates, some recent, some decades old. I could feel the span of time pressing against me, the memories of those who had vanished, their fear embedded in the scratches, in the walls, in the very air. I thought about my own footsteps, my own shadow flitting through the machinery. How small, how fragile. I must seem to whatever had left these messages. I felt a cold brush against my arm. Nothing, just air, but my skin prickled as if touched by a living hand. The factory had noticed me. Further down the wall, I found a section where the scratches formed a crude map. Arrows, lines, loops. A trail. I traced it with my finger, heart thumping. It led deeper into the factory, into sections I hadn't yet explored. My mind told me to leave. My instinct screamed at me to turn and run. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, propelled me forward. I followed the map past more machinery, past conveyor belts twisted into rusted knots, past empty crates and toppled shelves. The air grew colder, heavier, like breathing through a wet blanket. The shadows seemed to move more actively now, curling toward me and recoiling when I turned to focus on them. Then I saw it, a note pinned crudely to a beam with a rusted nail. Paper yellowed, edges torn. I picked it up carefully. The handwriting was frantic, jagged, desperate. They know you're here. Don't trust the machines. Don't trust the walls. Don't leave. My hand shook. I dropped the note, and it fluttered to the floor as if something inside the factory had pushed it, letting it fall just out of reach. The scraping returned, louder this time, echoing from the machinery. Something was moving. I could feel it before I saw it, pressing at the edge of my senses, shaping shadows, shifting air. I swallowed hard and pressed onward. The wall continued, covered in scratches, notes, symbols. A name caught my eye, repeated several times. Miller. Dates beside it showed a span of months. And then another name, Keller. Both names repeated, both crossed with heavy lines. A trail of despair etched into the brick. I realized then that the factory wasn't just abandoned. It had claimed people. It had remembered them. And now it remembered me. The scratching intensified, closer, moving toward me. My flashlight trembled in my hand. Shadows flitted along the floor, rising and falling as if alive. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I had seen worse, that this was just an old building. But every rational thought collided with the palpable awareness pressing against my chest. Something here was watching, calculating, waiting. A beam of light from the windows above caught something ahead, a note taped to a machine. I approached cautiously. The handwriting was messy, almost smeared. Follow the shadows. They will guide you, but they also lie. I froze. The words made no sense, yet felt urgent. The shadows, I had seen them, always just out of reach, curling, twisting, shaping themselves around the machines. Was the note warning me, or taunting me? A sudden metallic clang echoed from the far end of the hall. My flashlight swung instinctively. Shadows twisted violently, longer, stretching along the walls. And for a moment, I thought I saw a figure crouched behind a stack of crates, watching. Pale, thin, elongated, gone in the next heartbeat. I backed away slowly, trying to leave, but the walls seemed endless. The scratches continued, names, symbols, arrows, lines, all pointing deeper. Every step I took echoed like a drumbeat in the hollow space. I could feel eyes, not human, not fully, pressing from every corner. The air grew colder, sharper, almost metallic. My breath came in short bursts. I reached another note, pinned to a beam. Don't let them touch you. Don't answer. Don't follow. The words felt alive. The factory had written them for me. Or perhaps left them in warning. I didn't want to know. I wanted to leave. But my feet moved forward, drawn by something I couldn't resist. I came to a wall covered almost entirely in scratches. Symbols, names, arrows, lines forming patterns I couldn't decipher. Some lines ended in words. Alone, follow, don't look. Others ended in small, crude drawings. Faces twisted in terror, hands reaching, shapes too long, too thin, impossibly bent. The shadows shifted around me again. I could feel them pressing in, curling under machinery, along the walls, just beyond the reach of my light. Something breathed behind me, or maybe the building itself did. A low vibration in the floor, through the walls, through the air. The factory was alive, aware, patient. I tried to step back, and then I saw something etched deep into the brick. fresh scratches. My name. My handwriting? No, not mine. And beneath it, welcome. I staggered backward, heart hammering, flashlight beam swinging wildly. The shadows stretched, twisting, curling toward me. The factory's memory had accepted me, or perhaps it had claimed me. I wanted to leave. My mind screamed it, my instincts, but the walls seemed endless. The scratches, the messages, the whispers embedded in the brick. They were infinite, and I realized then that the factory was patient, waiting, not for me to leave, but to understand, to remember, to fear. I turned and ran, boots skidding on dust and broken metal. The shadows seemed to follow, flitting just out of reach, curling over beams, climbing machinery. I could feel them everywhere. And behind me, a faint scraping, deliberate, precise, not random, not accidental. Someone or something was here, always here, remembering the lost, the vanished, and now me. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the factory. Sunlight weak and pale through broken windows. The scratches and messages remained, etched into the walls, screaming silently. And I knew I couldn't forget, not the names, not the warnings, not the shapes that moved just beyond my sight. The factory had spoken, and it was patient. The factory felt alive in a way I couldn't describe. Not alive like machinery running, not alive like people moving, but alive in memory, in presence, in awareness. I had come to understand it over the last visits. Rust and shadows, messages scratched into the walls, the faint, deliberate movements at the edge of vision. And now, as I stepped further inside, the silence itself pressed against me, suffocating, patient. My flashlight quivered in my hand, cutting through the dust-laden air. Every step echoed, though the sound seemed exaggerated, stretched too long before fading. I could hear the hum of unseen pipes, the drip of water somewhere deep, the low creak of rusted beams settling under their own weight. And beneath it all, I felt a vibration, subtle but unmistakable, like the heartbeat of the building itself. I moved cautiously toward a side corridor I hadn't explored before, following the trail of scratches that had guided me last time. The walls were covered with marks, names, and crude symbols, etched in desperate hands over decades. Each name felt heavy, each word pressing into my chest. I ran my fingers lightly over the scratches, afraid of what acknowledging them might summon. Then it happened, a sudden pressure, like a hand closing over my chest. I stumbled, flashlight beam swinging wildly. The air seemed thicker, impossible to inhale. My heartbeat raced, every breath coming short, jagged, as if the factory itself had decided to weigh me down. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself, my mind screaming that this wasn't normal, that it wasn't rational. A sound, a soft, dragging noise, echoed through the corridor, not from the floor, not from the walls, but from somewhere in the silence itself. I turned slowly, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Shadows twisted against the walls, curling and stretching in impossible ways. I thought I saw a figure crouched just beyond my reach, pale and thin, its limbs elongated, bent at angles that didn't make sense. My pulse slammed in my chest. I forced myself to step backward, tripping over a broken crate. It clattered to the floor, metal, and with colliding. The sound should have alerted whatever was there. But there was nothing, only silence, only the weight pressing against my chest, pressing against my lungs, making it hard to breathe. I moved again, slower this time, every step deliberate. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing the corridor, bending the light of my flashlight in ways that made it impossible to distinguish distance. Shadows pooled in corners, not random, but deliberate, curling like smoke around the edges of perception. I felt eyes on me, not human eyes, not fully, something that didn't need sight to see. A low scraping began behind me, deliberate, slow, moving along the floor. My head whipped around. Nothing. I turned back to the path ahead, and then I noticed it, a faint outline on the wall, just beyond the flashlight's beam. It was me, or at least it looked like me, but wrong. Shifting, blurred, stretched. The outline reached toward me, curling along the bricks, fading when I blinked, reappearing when I looked away. I swallowed hard, shaking. This wasn't real. It had to be exhaustion. My mind playing tricks. But deep in my chest, I knew better. The factory had remembered me. Not just my presence, but my fear, my hesitation, my curiosity. And it was shaping the darkness to study me. I stumbled forward, flashlight swinging, heart hammering. Another corridor opened to my left, and I ducked into it instinctively. The walls here were covered in older scratches. Names faded nearly into the brick. But even in the dim light, I could make out words. Leave, alone, never again. Some lines were crossed, others encircled. Desperation pressed out from the markings, thick and tangible. Then the pressure hit again, stronger this time, as if the air itself had condensed around me. My lungs burned, my chest tightened. I couldn't inhale fully. I stumbled, catching myself on the wall. The corridor stretched impossibly long, the ceiling bending, walls curling inward in ways that should have been impossible. Shadows pulled along the edges, growing, twisting. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught, lost in the emptiness. A noise came from the far end of the corridor. Soft at first, deliberate. A step, another, and then a whisper. Not words, not fully. Just sound. Low, humming, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, through me. The factory spoke, and I felt it more than heard it. I forced my legs to move, one step after another, toward the exit at the end of the hall. But the corridor stretched endlessly. My flashlight beam shook, bouncing off walls that didn't align, floors that dipped and rose. The shadows moved with me, curling around my legs, brushing my arms, teasing my perception. I could feel shapes just beyond reach, brushing my consciousness. Then I saw them, figures, pale, thin, crouched between machines, stacked crates, hanging pipes, not fully formed, distorted, elongated, watching, waiting. When I focused on one, it disappeared. When I looked away, it reappeared, closer, always patient, never rushing, but always aware of me. I tried to turn back. The corridor I had entered vanished, or at least, it didn't lead anywhere I recognized. The walls pressed closer, shadows pooling thickly along the edges of the floor. The air vibrated again, low and constant, like a pulse. I realized then that I was trapped in the silence, in the presence of the factory itself. My mind raced, grasping for rational explanations. Exhaustion, shadows, echoes, imagination. None of it held up, not after the night, not after messages, not after the shapes that had followed me, always just beyond the edge of sight. The factory had a memory, and now it had me in it. I pressed on, running now, boots skidding over dust and broken metal. The figures flicker around me, moving in impossible ways, brushing against walls, slipping beneath machinery. The air pressed tighter. My chest burned, my lungs screamed. Every step felt heavier, slower, as if the building itself resisted my escape. I remembered the old notes, the scratch warnings. They had been right. Don't follow. Don't trust. Don't leave. I had ignored them. I had walked too far. And now, the factory was patient, studying, shaping the silence around me. At a bend in the corridor, I tripped over something soft. My flashlight beam fell on a body. A person, pale, almost translucent, eyes wide with terror, limbs twisted. Or maybe it wasn't fully a person. I couldn't tell. My stomach roiled. My fingers shook as I scrambled past. It didn't move, but I felt its awareness, its gaze, pressing into me. I stumbled into an open hall, and there it was, light, weak, slanting through broken windows. A door at the far end, the only exit I recognized. Relief surged through me, a spark of hope. I ran. The shadows followed, twisting, curling along the walls and floor. My chest burned. My lungs screamed, but the door was close, almost within reach. Then a presence, thick, suffocating, overwhelming, brushed against my back. Not wind, not a person. Something conscious, aware. I stumbled forward, almost falling, feeling the pressure of it, the weight of its attention. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The door was ahead. I lunged, yanking it open. Fresh air hit me like a blow. Sunlight, weak but real, spilled into my face. I fell forward, gasping, coughing, shaking. Behind me, the factory loomed silent. Shadows pulled, but they didn't move outside. The presence didn't follow, not beyond the threshold. I collapsed on the ground outside, chest heaving, fingers scraping dirt. The building looked empty, abandoned, rusted, decaying, silent. And yet I knew better. I had felt it inside, had been suffocated by it, studied by it. The factory was patient, waiting, not violent, at least not yet, but aware, alive in a way that didn't need flesh or breath to haunt. I tried to stand, trembling, thoughts scattered. I wanted to tell someone, warn them, but who could understand? Who could believe the shapes, the pressure, the silent awareness that had pressed against me? My mind reeled. I felt smaller, fragile, inconsequential. And yet, I knew the factory remembered me. The scratches, the shadows, the figures, all had recorded my presence. I backed away slowly, not daring to turn my back. The sunlight felt fragile, like it couldn't protect me. I glanced over my shoulder. The windows were dark again, the machinery hidden in shadow. But I knew, just beyond the edge of perception, the factory's memory lingered. The silence was patient, and one day it would call again. I walked away, boots heavy on the overgrown path outside. Every sound, every shifting shadow in the parking lot made my skin prickle. I didn't run. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to breathe, needed to process. But the memory of the suffocating presence, of the patient awareness, would not leave me. And I knew, deep in the pit of my stomach, that I hadn't truly escaped. The factory's reach was long, its memory sharp. I had survived, but the mystery remained unsolved. The building had claimed part of me, and I would carry it forever. The sun rose higher, light spilling over the abandoned grounds. The shadows of machinery and walls stretched thin, dissolving into ordinary decay. But I could feel the presence in the silence behind me, waiting, patient, immortal. And I knew, even as I turned the corner onto the road, that the factory had not finished with me. I first heard about the Lantern Man on a summer evening, the kind where the sky seems to hang low, heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. Everyone in Pine Creek had a story. Old folks whispered in the diner. Kids dared each other to go near the creek at night. And even the mailman, who never cared for gossip, refused to walk past the bend alone after dusk. At first, I thought it was just another small-town myth, something to pass the time when the days dragged on and the nights grew long. But there was a way people spoke about it, like the name itself carried weight, like calling it aloud might draw it closer. The Lantern Man, they'd say, and their voices would drop, as though the words were dangerous. It started with strange lights, a glow that moved like a fire caught in fog, bobbing along the edge of the creek just as the sun dipped behind the trees. I remember the first time I saw it. I had taken my bike down the old path that ran parallel to the water, the air thick with the smell of pine sap and damp moss. The light appeared like a lantern swinging slowly, carried by someone invisible, or maybe by something that wasn't human at all. My stomach sank the moment I realized it wasn't just a trick of the sunlight through the trees. I stopped, bike leaning against a gnarled root, heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing else. No sound of footsteps, no snapping of twigs, nothing but the steady, haunting glow drifting closer to the water. I remember thinking I should run, but my legs refused. My brain kept whispering that it was impossible, that no one could be out there alone at this hour. Yet my eyes wouldn't look away. Locals say the Lantern Man only shows up at dusk. Some say he was once a man, lost in the creek one winter, wandering too far from the path and never coming back. Others claim he's older than the town itself. A spirit tied to the creek and the trees, a warning and a curse all at once. Every explanation felt half true, like each person had glimpsed a different version of him, shaped by the shadows of their own fears. That first encounter left me restless for days. Sleep was broken, filled with fleeting glimpses of light moving through my bedroom. Or so I convinced myself. Every shadow seemed like it could stretch into something alive. I started avoiding the creek, taking a longer road home. But curiosity gnawed at me like a persistent ache. I asked around, quietly. The diner was the best place to pick up pieces. An old man named Harris, who had lived in Pine Creek his whole life, leaned over the counter one morning, his eyes narrowing as he lowered his voice. "Seen him?" he asked. No one else was around. I shook my head, though my palms were sweating. "He's out there, all right. Comes every summer when the light starts fading early. Some folks say he's looking for something. Others say he's looking for someone." His hand shook slightly as he sipped his coffee. Best keep clear. I wanted to ask more, but something in his expression, part fear, part warning, made me stop. The Lantern Man wasn't just a story here. He was real, and people who had seen him didn't talk about it much afterward. Not unless they were sure no one would laugh. Weeks passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had glimpsed something permanent in that light. Every evening, as the sky turned orange and the shadows stretched over the creek, I found myself walking closer. The path was narrow, lined with pine that scraped at my shoulders. The air smelled of water and decay. And then, inevitably, the glow appeared. It wasn't always the same. Sometimes it floated high above the water, hanging in the mist like a suspended star. Other times it moved quickly, darting behind trees, almost playful, almost human. And always, it drew me in. There was something familiar in the way it hovered, a loneliness that made my chest ache. The first few times I tried to follow it, I lost my courage. I would stop halfway down the path, heart racing, convincing myself that I had imagined it. But each time I turned back toward town, I felt a tug in my chest, like the creek itself was calling me. One evening I waited. The sky was bruised with violet and gray, the creek black beneath the fading light. I heard the soft snap of twigs and saw it then, the glow, pale and steady, drifting along the bank. And this time, I didn't look away. I called out, though my voice sounded small and absurd in the open air. "Who's there?" The light hesitated, as if acknowledging me, then moved closer. My knees went weak. I wanted to run, and I wanted to stay at the same time. There was something about the way it glowed, soft and persistent, that made it impossible to feel fear and awe separately. I remembered Harris's words again. Some folks say he's looking for someone. I wondered if he meant me, or if it was just the pull of something ancient, something tied to the creek and the forest, calling out at anyone who dared to notice. I wanted to see him clearly, to understand. I stepped closer. The air grew colder, not a sharp cold, but one that seeped into the bones, like the first hint of winter in early October. My breath came out in soft clouds. The water moved silently beside me, reflecting the faint glow, and in that reflection, I thought I saw a shape, a figure, tall and thin, holding a lantern, its face hidden beneath a shadow I couldn't pierce. Then it stopped. The lantern swung slightly, and I thought I saw a movement beneath it. Not fast, not sudden, just a slow, deliberate sway. And for the first time, I felt the story shift. This wasn't just a spirit to scare children. This was something that watched, something that waited, something patient. I don't remember leaving the creek that night. I only remember the memory of the glow lingering in my vision, even as I lay in bed, awake and trembling. Every night afterward, I would hear the creek in my dreams, the faint scrape of water over rock and the soft, insistent glow calling me back. The Lantern Man became a quiet obsession. I began noting the times he appeared, the angle of the light, the way the mist curled around the trees. Each sighting was a whisper, each glow a question I couldn't answer. And the more I observed, the more I understood that Pine Creek held secrets that weren't meant to be spoken, only seen, only felt. By the end of that first summer, I wasn't sure if I was chasing the Lantern Man, or if he had been waiting for me all along. I didn't know whether to fear him or to follow. All I knew was that when dusk fell over the creek, the world outside Pine Creek seemed to vanish. There was only the glow, the cold air, and the quiet, undeniable pull of something not entirely human. I can't say why I kept going back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, maybe it was something I couldn't name. But every time I saw that lantern swinging through the mist, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a story that had been told before I was even born, and that once you notice it, it never let you go. And so, the sightings continued. Each evening at dusk, the light appeared, wandering the edges of the creek. I never saw anyone carrying it. I never saw the face beneath the shadow, only the lantern, steady and glowing, moving like a heartbeat through the fog. People will laugh if you tell them. They will say it's just fireflies, or old stories that grew taller with each retelling. But I know what I saw, and I know it's real. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind shifts and the trees groan softly, I swear I can hear the soft scrape of boots, or something else, walking just beyond the shadows, and the lantern swinging ever so gently, waiting. I couldn't stay away. Even when I told myself to forget it, the glow lingered in my mind, swinging softly over the creek, tugging at something I didn't understand. I found myself back on the path one evening, just as the sun began to bleed out behind the pines. The air was heavier than usual, thick with damp and the faint scent of rot, the kind that clings to old forests and old secrets. I told myself I wasn't following him. I told myself I was just observing, but the truth is, I needed to know. I needed to see where the light went when it disappeared into the trees, to understand if it was real or a trick, and if it was real, what it wanted. The first step off the path was the hardest. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and fallen pine needles that whispered underfoot. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, just a thin line against the shadows. Then I saw it, a faint, steady glow weaving between the trees. The lantern man, or whatever it was. My chest tightened, but I moved forward anyway, like my legs had decided for me. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. Birds stopped their evening calls. The wind slowed. Even the creek, usually alive with the soft murmur of moving water, seemed to hold its breath. And there it was again, swinging gently, almost lazily, as if it had been waiting for me to follow. I didn't know how long I walked, but the forest around me began to feel unnatural. The trees leaned too close, their trunks twisted, bark scarred with scratches that didn't make sense. Marks like claws or nails gouged into the wood. I froze when I realized some were symbols, strange etchings in the shape of spirals and triangles. They weren't fresh. Some were older, darkened with time, almost blending into the bark. I knelt to touch one, tracing it lightly with my fingers. The wood felt cold, like it had absorbed the chill of winter long ago. Something about the pattern made my stomach churn. I wanted to look away, but my eyes kept finding more. On the ground, half buried in pine needles, I saw fragments of things I couldn't name, small relics, pieces of metal, maybe charms. Some were twisted into strange shapes, like attempts at symbols I didn't understand. Others looked like small bones, bleached and brittle. I swallowed hard. This was no ordinary myth. Someone or something had been leaving traces here for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, the lantern man was part of it. Part of a ritual I wasn't meant to witness. I stood and continued. The glow always just ahead. It wasn't fast. It didn't flee. It simply moved, deliberate and calm, as if it knew I was following and allowed me to. I want to call out again, to demand answers, but my throat was dry, my voice trapped somewhere behind my ribs. So I walked, keeping my flashlight off, letting the pale light of the lantern guide me. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. Roots twisted into shapes that looked like faces. Shadows pooled like stagnant water, and the scent of decay grew stronger. And I noticed the trees had marks all over, not random scratches, but patterns that repeated. Spirals, lines, tiny crosses. They led me deeper, almost like a trail. I didn't want to follow, but something inside me, a part one didn't recognize, urged me onward. At some point, the glow slowed and then stopped entirely. I froze, scanning the trees, trying to see through the thickening darkness. That's when I saw it. A clearing, circular, the ground covered in fallen needles. And in the center, something that made my heart pound in my throat. A circle of stones, carefully placed, almost altar-like. Within it, more relics, bones, rusted objects, shards of glass. I couldn't tell what had been sacrificed here or why, but the place hummed with an energy I couldn't explain. And there, at the edge of the clearing, the lantern hovered, swinging gently in the mist that now began to rise from the ground. I wanted to step closer. I wanted to touch it, to see the figure beneath. But the air grew heavier, charged, like the forest was holding its breath. The shadows shifted unnaturally, and I thought I saw shapes moving just beyond the tree line. Figures crouched, watching. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but curiosity rooted me in place. I noticed the ground near the altar was scarred, scratched as if something had dragged itself across the earth. And then I saw more markings, not carved into trees, but pressed into the dirt itself. Footprints? No. Too thin, too elongated, almost human, almost not. They led away from the altar, winding deeper into the woods, vanishing as if swallowed by the earth. I followed them cautiously, every step deliberate. The glow followed too, never getting closer, never retreating, like it was pacing me, testing me. As I moved, I thought I could hear whispers. Not words exactly, but voices, faint and broken, curling around the trees and into my ears. I spun, flashlight rays, but there was nothing. Only shadows. Only the cold, wet smell of moss and decay. I thought of the stories, of Harris's warning, of everyone in Pine Creek who had glimpsed a lantern man and gone quiet afterward. I realized I was starting to understand why. The forest wasn't just a forest. The creek wasn't just a creek. There were layers here, hidden under the ordinary world. And the lantern man was part of something much older, something patient and deliberate. I walked further until the glow paused at the edge of a small ravine. The drop was steep, the soil loose, but the lantern hovered just above it, swaying like it wanted me to follow. My stomach twisted with fear and anticipation. I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't. My legs moved on their own, carrying me to the edge. There, pressed into the dirt at the ravine's edge, were more relics. Tiny carved figures, fragments of cloth, rusted tools, bones so small I thought they might be animal, but I wasn't sure. My fingers brushed against one, and I almost retched. It felt like I had crossed a threshold I could never uncross. The lantern moved again, deeper into the ravine, and I followed. The slope was steep, forcing me to lower myself carefully, hands brushing the earth and roots. Every sound seemed amplified. The scuff of my boots, the rustle of pine needles, the distant murmur of the creek far below. And then I saw it. The water, dark and still, reflecting the fading light of the lantern in eerie patterns. I crouched at the edge, trying to understand what I was seeing. The lantern floated just above the water, and for a moment, I thought I saw the figure clearly. Tall, thin, impossibly still, face hidden beneath a shadow. There was no motion beyond the lantern's gentle sway. Yet the air around it felt alive, electric, like something was watching me as closely as I watched it. I realized then that I had been holding my breath for what felt like hours, and I understood something I hadn't before. The lantern man wasn't moving through the forest aimlessly. He was guiding me, showing me, testing me. And whatever this place was, whatever these relics were, I had been chosen, or at least noticed. I didn't know how long I stayed there. Time seemed to fold in the woods, minutes stretching into what felt like hours. I wanted to reach out, to step closer, but something stopped me. A quiet, insistent voice in my mind that told me I wasn't ready. Not yet. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the glow lifted and began to move again, deeper into the trees, vanishing into the mist. I wanted to follow, but fear and exhaustion finally took hold. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the mossy ground, heart hammering, every nerve alive with tension. I lay there for a long time, listening. The forest returned to its ordinary sound slowly. The whisper of the wind, the distant creak, the occasional rustle of unseen animals. But the image of the lantern lingered in my vision, bright against the dark, swinging gently as if waiting for me to return. When I finally made my way back to the path, the forest seemed larger, more suffocating, as though it had stretched while I was away. And I understood that this was only the beginning. There were layers to the lantern man, and he was patient. He moved slowly, but nothing escaped his gaze. And now, I was part of whatever game or ritual he had been carrying out for decades, perhaps centuries. I walked home that night in silence. The glow of the lantern burned into my mind, its sway echoing like a heartbeat I could not escape. And even now, when I close my eyes, I see it, drifting through the mist, steady and unrelenting, calling me back to the woods, to the relics, to the circle of stones, to whatever waits beyond. The Lantern Man isn't just a story. He's a presence. And if you ever see him, you won't forget. He won't let you forget. It started small, almost imperceptible at first. A missing hiker here. A neighbor not showing up to work there. People whisper about them in Pine Creek. But no one said it out loud. Not directly. Maybe because saying it made it real. Maybe because everyone already feared the answer. I remember the first time it hit close to home. Marcy, a girl from school who worked at the diner, didn't come in for her shift one evening. That alone wouldn't have been strange. She often stayed home with headaches. But she didn't answer her phone. By the next morning, when even her mother's calls went unanswered, the town started to murmur. I tried to convince myself it was just one of those things. A long night at a friend's house, a dead phone battery, something ordinary. But the timing was wrong. It was just after dusk, when the first glow of the lantern had appeared over the creek. Then came Tommy, the mailman. He vanished on his evening route. His truck was found abandoned near the creek, engine still warm. The doors were unlocked, bags of mail scattered, but no sign of him. People started gathering at the diner, speaking in low, frantic tones. Some tried to laugh it off, but their eyes betrayed them. Everyone remembered the glow. Everyone remembered the creek. I tried to stay away. I really did. I told myself it was coincidence, that I had let my imagination run wild with the Lantern Man stories. But the truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that glow swinging gently, beckoning me deeper into the forest. Every time I passed the creek, I felt like something was watching, waiting for me to notice again. One evening, curiosity, or maybe fear, drove me back. The path was quiet, almost too quiet. The creek whispered in its usual low voice, but the air was thick, pressing against my skin like a living thing. I knew the lantern would appear. I just didn't know if I wanted it to. And then it did. The glow, pale and steady, swaying between the trees like it always had. Only this time it wasn't distant. It felt closer, as if aware of my thoughts. I followed it cautiously, moving along the edges of the creek, keeping my steps light, trying not to disturb the shadows. That's when I saw the first clue. A boot, half buried in mud, and next to it, a torn piece of clothing. I recognized the colors immediately. Marcy's jacket, faded from too many washes. My stomach twisted. I wanted to turn away, to convince myself it was something else, but the lantern hovered just beyond the mud, waiting. I picked up the fabric carefully. It smelled faintly of pine and damp, like the forest had absorbed it. There was no sign of Marcy, no footprints leading away, just the fabric and the soft, unyielding glow of the lantern. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. This wasn't random. This was an accident. Someone, or something, was taking them. Days passed. More people vanished. Hikers, teenagers out camping, old Mr. Hawkins who lived near the far bend of the creek. The town grew tense, nervous. Meetings at the diner became more frequent, though no one dared suggest the truth aloud. And every time someone disappeared, I felt it in my chest, that same pull I had felt the first night I saw the lantern. I started to notice patterns. The disappearances always happened near dusk, always near the creek. And when I dared to investigate, faint traces remained. A scarf snag on a branch. Footprints that didn't look quite human. Strange scratches in bark. The air thick with the smell of wet earth and something older, something I couldn't name. I knew I should stay away. Every instinct told me to lock my doors, to avoid the woods, to ignore the glow. But I couldn't. I became obsessed. Every evening I checked the edges of the creek, watching for that swaying light. Every night it appeared, sometimes higher in the trees, sometimes lower, as if it was toying with me, drawing me in. One night, I found footprints leading off the path. They were elongated, narrow, like fingers pressed into the mud. I followed them cautiously, keeping my distance, and the lantern swayed ahead of me like a pale heartbeat. I reached the clearing, the one with a circle of stones and relics, and froze. The ground was scarred with more than just footprints. There were marks in the dirt, shallow depressions, almost as if something had been dragged into the center of the circle. And there at the edge of the clearing, I saw them. Marcy, Tommy, even Mr. Hawkins. Not alive, not dead, but suspended in some sort of state I couldn't understand. Their eyes were open, blank, staring at nothing. Their bodies were still, but they were there, pulled toward the center of the circle, tethered to something unseen. The lantern hovered above them, swinging gently, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't look away. Something in the glow was compelling, hypnotic, pulling me closer even as my mind screamed for me to flee. I thought of Harris's warning, of every hushed conversation in the diner. He was looking for someone. And now I understood. The lantern man wasn't just wandering. He was selecting, choosing, taking. And if he had noticed me before, if he had been watching, then I could be next. I stumbled backward, barely keeping my footing. The lantern moved slightly, almost as if acknowledging me, and I realized the truth. It knew I was there. I felt its gaze, though I couldn't see eyes, and I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on me. Whatever this creature or spirit was, it had patience, and it had purpose. I ran. I ran without thinking, following the path back to town, my lungs burning, my chest aching. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of streetlights and houses, until I could hear the distant hum of cars and the chatter of late-night diners. But the memory of the clearing stayed with me. The sight of the missing, suspended like marionettes, haunted every moment. Sleep became impossible. I dreamed of the creak, of the glow, of hands reaching from shadows. And when I woke, the forest seemed closer, the darkness more present, the stories in town more urgent, whispered in half-formed sentences and nervous glances. I tried to warn people, but who would believe me? The diner conversations became frantic, fragmented. They just vanished, someone whispered. No footprints, nothing left behind. People looked at each other like they were hoping someone else had answers. But no one did, not really. And no one dared go near the creek after dusk anymore. I kept my distance for a few days, convincing myself that was enough. But the lantern returned, as always, and so did my curiosity, my obsession. One night, I saw it hovering near the edge of the creek, and I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. If the lantern man was real, and I knew he was, I needed to understand why. What was happening to these people? Why them? Why now? I began taking notes, careful observations, times of sightings, positions of the glow, the placement of stones and relics. Every detail mattered, and every detail terrified me. The patterns were deliberate, methodical. Whoever, or whatever, was behind it had been doing this for a long time, maybe even decades. And the disappearances didn't stop. More people vanished. Sometimes hikers, sometimes kids walking dogs along the creek. Their belongings would be found scattered, backpacks slashed open, shoes missing, jackets snagged in trees. But the people themselves, gone. And the lantern always appeared, swaying gently, almost indifferent, as if marking the end of something I couldn't yet comprehend. I realized, finally, that this wasn't just a legend, not a story to scare children. This was a predator, patient and cunning, bound to the creek, the forest, the stones and relics I had stumbled upon. And I had been watching it for weeks, trailing its movements, knowing the risks, unable to stop myself. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I was being chosen. But I did know one thing. The disappearances were only beginning. And as long as the lantern swung over the creek, nothing would be the same in Pine Creek again. I feel its presence still in the shadows, in the spaces between trees, in the quiet moments when the wind is too still and the night too dark. And I know, deep down, that the lantern is waiting for me, or for someone else, to notice it too late. I knew I shouldn't have gone back. Every instinct screamed at me as I stepped onto the path leading toward the creek that night. The air was thick, suffocating, like the forest had drawn in its breath and was holding it, waiting for me to arrive. Yet, I couldn't stop myself. Not after what I'd seen, not after the disappearances, not after the glow had pulled at me for weeks like a magnet I couldn't resist. The path was nearly invisible in the darkness, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. My flashlight barely cut through black, just enough to illuminate the rough roots beneath my feet. The creek whispered somewhere to my left, its usual murmur sounding distorted, almost mournful, as though it was warning me to turn back. And then I saw it, the lantern, pale and steady, swaying gently between the trees, like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I wanted to run, to step away, but I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer, closer to the glow, closer to whatever was behind it. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The air grew colder, denser, smelling of wet moss and decay. Shadows clung to the trees in strange shapes, twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. My heart raced with each step, pounding against my ribs like it wanted to escape. And then I saw them, relics and marks I had traced before, only now they seemed fresher, sharper, bones, shards of metal, torn pieces of fabric, pressed into the dirt as though the ground itself remembered the disappearances. I wanted to look away. I wanted to tell myself it was a nightmare I could wake from, but the lantern hovered just ahead, swaying gently, and something deep in my chest told me that this was real, that I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't comprehend. I stepped into the clearing, the circle of stones rising out of the ground like a silent altar. The relics were scattered in a pattern that made my stomach twist. And there at the center, the missing townsfolk. Not alive, not dead, but in a state that made my skin crawl. Marcy, Tommy, Mr. Hawkins. Their eyes were open, vacant, and they were suspended as if the earth itself refused to release them. The lantern floated above them, swaying in the mist that now rose thick around the clearing. Its light cast long, trembling shadows, shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, whispering promises I couldn't hear but felt in every nerve. I should have turned and run then. I should have obeyed the voice in my head that screamed for me to escape, but I was too close. I couldn't look away. The glow pulsed, almost as if acknowledging me, and I felt it, something ancient, deliberate, like a weight pressing on my mind, testing me. And then I saw a movement, not from the missing, not from the trees, but something shifting just beyond the clearing, in the corner of my vision. Shadows bending, stretching, coiling in ways that defied reason. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, realizing for the first time that I wasn't just observing. I was part of it. The lantern had noticed me long before I noticed it. I turned to run. My boots slipped on wet earth, roots catching my ankles, branches clawing at my jacket. The forest seemed to shift, changing shape, elongating, folding over itself. I could hear whispers now, low and urgent, circling me, impossible to understand but impossible to ignore. The lantern rose, higher now, floating toward me with a calm, terrible patience. It was slower than a human could move, but every second stretched into eternity. I could feel its gaze even without eyes, a pressure against my skull that made my thoughts stumble. Panic clawed at me, sharp and cold, but I forced myself to keep moving. Branches scratched my face and arms, roots tore at my clothes. Every step forward felt like running through a dream where the ground was liquid, and the air was thick with fear. The whispers grew louder, forming patterns I couldn't recognize, voices melding into one relentless, impossible sound. I tripped. I fell hard, scraping my knees, and my flashlight rolled out of reach, the beam flickering across the twisted undergrowth before dying. I was plunged into darkness, the only light the cold glow of the lantern, moving slowly, inexorably toward me. I scrambled to my feet, hands trembling, lungs burning. My mind raced with fragments of everything I had seen, the relics, the missing, the empty eyes of those suspended in the clearing. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold in the night air. The lantern was guiding me. It wasn't just a light. It was a signal, a summons, a predator's lure. I ran blindly, guided by memory and instinct, the lantern hovering behind me now, swinging gently, almost teasingly. The forest seemed endless, folding in on itself, roots and branches bending to block my escape. Every shadow became a figure, every rustle a threat. The whispers followed me, pressing into my mind, dragging at my sanity. And then I saw the creek, the familiar bend, the dark water shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Relief surged briefly. I knew the way out. I thought I could make it. But the lantern rose above me, its glow bathing the trees, revealing shapes I hadn't noticed before. Figures crouched just beyond the edge, watching, waiting. I didn't stop to think. I jumped the roots, leapt over the fallen logs, and sprinted toward the streetlights of the town beyond. The forest resisted. Branches whipped my face, roots tore at my shoes, and the whispers clawed at my mind. I stumbled into a clearing near the road, and looked back once. The lantern had stopped at the forest's edge, swaying gently, unmoving, as if it knew I had escaped this time. But I could feel it, patient and inevitable, watching, waiting. I made it home, slamming the door behind me, trembling, gasping for air. Every sound inside my house felt amplified. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the fridge, even the distant howl of a dog. The lantern's glow haunted my vision, replaying in flashes when I closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come. I lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the windows, imagining shapes in the shadows of my room. The creek called to me in dreams, the glow swinging between the trees, always just out of reach, always pulling, always patient. Days passed, and Pine Creek didn't return to normal. More whispers circulated about the disappearances. Some families left town, some stayed, silent and anxious. The creek remained a place no one dared visit after dusk, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop seeing it. I realized then that the Lantern Man didn't need to hunt me actively. The knowledge of him, the awareness of the glow, was enough. The anticipation, the fear, the obsession, that was part of whatever he'd been doing for decades. I had seen him, followed him, and that alone had bound me to him in a way I could never escape. Sometimes I catch glimpses of him from my window, just a faint glow, swaying between the trees at the creek's edge. I tell myself it's a trick of the fog, the reflection of a distant streetlight. But deep down I know it isn't. I know he's still there, waiting, patient, deliberate. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if anyone will ever see them missing again. I don't know if I will ever be free of this, or if the Lantern Man is simply waiting for the right moment to reach me, or someone else. All I know is this: the darkness remains. The glow swings gently in the trees. And Pine Creek will never be the same. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the shadows long, I can feel the pull again, and I know, with a cold certainty, that the Lantern Man hasn't forgotten me. And maybe that is the worst part. He never forgets. I first noticed the house the day I moved in. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would usually pay attention to. The paint was faded, windows dusted with grime, the lawn overgrown and untended. Yet, there was something about it that made my stomach tighten every time I walked past. Something that felt wrong. When I saw the for sale sign swing loosely in the wind, I remember thinking, of course no one wanted this place. Even now, I can't tell if it was instinct or just the stories I told myself to keep my curiosity alive. I hadn't been in the neighborhood long when the new owners arrived. A family, quiet, polite, smiling but with an edge of something unspoken. I waved from my porch the first day they unloaded boxes. They waved back, but the father's eyes lingered on the house in a way that made me shiver. Almost like he could see the memories trapped in the walls, the way the old floors remembered the weight of things long gone. It wasn't until a week later, when I noticed lights flickering in the basement window, that my curiosity really took hold. I had been trimming the hedge along the property line, listening to the hum of summer insects, when I saw it, shadows moving behind the grime-streaked glass. Not children, not furniture, something else. Something slow, deliberate. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But I found myself watching the house at odd hours, waiting, imagining, feeling that cold press of unease curling in my chest. The shadows seemed to pulse, moving in ways that didn't quite make sense. And then came the smell, a faint rotten scent that drifted through the cracked window, clinging to the night air, cloying and sweet in a way that made me gag. One evening, curiosity overwhelmed caution. The family was away, gone for the weekend, they said, and I found myself standing at the basement door. The old steps creaked under my weight as I descended, the darkness swallowing me whole. My flashlight cut a thin line to the black, revealing walls streaked with water damage, dust, and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The basement felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. The air was thick, heavy with a scent of mildew, damp earth, and something older, fouler, that I couldn't identify. My chest tightened, my stomach churned, and yet I couldn't stop myself from moving further in. That's when I saw the markings, carved into wood beams, faint scratches that at first looked like the work of rats. But the more I stared, the more they revealed themselves. Symbols, rough and jagged, spirals and lines that didn't make sense, letters that didn't belong to any language I recognized. My fingers hovered over them, trembling, though it felt cold under my touch. Colder than it should have been. And then I saw the stains. Dark, dried patches on the concrete floor, too irregular to be paint, too old to be blood I could recognize. Yet the shapes made my stomach twist. Some of them were faint, almost fading into the cracks, but the way they trailed toward the far wall, toward a small trapdoor, made my skin crawl. I remember the stories I'd heard as a kid about basements, about old houses that held secrets no one wanted to uncover. I had laughed at them then. I didn't laugh anymore. The trapdoor beckoned. It wasn't locked. I hesitated, hands shaking over the handle, listening. The basement was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator above, the distant creak of a settling house. I opened it slowly, the hinges groaning, and a putrid gust of air escaped, carried with it the smell of rot and mold and something far worse, something that made my head swim. A ladder descended into darkness. The walls of the shaft were damp, slick with moisture. I knew I shouldn't go down. Every instinct told me to turn back, leave, forget, but my feet moved anyway. Step by step, I descended, the darkness pressing in from all sides, thick and almost alive. My flashlight flickered, throwing uncertain shadows that seemed to shift and ride in the corners of my vision. At the bottom, the air was colder, stagnant, heavy, and then I saw it. The room, the space was small and narrow, filled with remnants of things that shouldn't have existed. Furniture stacked oddly, chairs with their legs broken, tables overturned. On the walls, more markings, more scratches, symbols I couldn't interpret but felt in my bones. I could feel them. They weren't just on the wood. They were in the wood, as if the house itself remembered what had been done here. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, and that's when I noticed jars, rows of them, lying along a shelf, coated in dust, each sealed tight with corks, each filled with something I didn't want to look at too closely. Shapes, small and malformed, pressed against the glass, preserved in murky liquid. My stomach turned violently. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to leave, to forget, but I couldn't. My eyes kept returning to the jars, as though they were alive, calling me closer. And then I saw the journal, a small leather-bound book tucked beneath a pile of tattered rags. I picked it up with trembling hands. The pages were yellowed brittle, filled with cramped handwriting that grew more erratic as I turned them. Accounts of rituals, descriptions of strange occurrences in the house, lists of names, dates, and what I could only assume were the intentions behind the markings and the jars. The words burned into my mind with clarity that made my head spin. They watch. They wait. The basement remembers. I remember reading one entry over and over, unable to comprehend fully, my pulse hammering in my ears. It described the house, not as a home, but as a living thing, feeding, preserving, and luring. It spoke of something beneath, something patient, something that had watched all who entered, shaping the lives above it, taking what it needed. The air grew colder still, and I realized I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it, not yet, but I felt it. Something heavy, lurking in the shadows, watching. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. Something tall, thin, impossible, just beyond the beam. I dropped the journal, stumbling backward, every nerve screaming to get out. I ran, up the ladder, fumbling over the trapdoor, slamming it shut above me. The basement was silent again, as if nothing had happened, as if the air hadn't pressed down on me, hadn't whispered warnings I could barely understand. My hand shook as I pressed against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to convince myself I had imagined it all. But I hadn't. I could still feel it. The weight of the basement, the smell of the jars, the echo of the journal's words. The house was alive in ways I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that the old house next door had watched me from the moment I arrived, waiting, patient, deliberate. I spent the night awake, listening. Every creak, Every side of the house above me made my blood run cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, just beyond the walls, just beneath the floorboards, and I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. By morning, I forced myself to leave. I needed fresh air, light, the ordinary hum of the neighborhood to remind me that the world wasn't entirely filled with shadows. But even as I stepped onto my porch, I glanced at the old house next door. Its windows stared back, empty and accusing. The house didn't seem abandoned anymore. It seemed aware, and I knew that what I had seen was only the beginning. The basement remembered, the house remembered, and somehow I had become a part of its memory. I haven't gone back. I don't plan to, but every time I hear a creak, a whisper of movement, I think of the basement, the jars, the journal, and I feel that same cold press against my chest. Waiting, watching, remembering. Even now, I can't shake it. The old house next door isn't just a house. It's a witness. It's a keeper. And I fear, more than anything, that it's waiting for me to notice it again. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement. Even in the light of day, its darkness clung to me, a shadow pressed behind my eyes. Every floorboard creak in my own house made me jump. Every wind gust rattling the windows felt like the house next door whispering my name. I tried to tell myself it was over. That curiosity hadn't pushed me far enough to become part of whatever was there. But the truth is, I had already been marked. I just didn't know it yet. The first night after the discovery, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room, staring out the window, watching the old house next door. Its windows seemed emptier than ever, dark and still, yet I could feel it watching me. Not just the house, the space beneath it, the basement, the shadows that moved differently from the light. I didn't know how to explain it, but I could feel something stirring, something patient, something alive or unalive, moving just beneath the surface of my perception. Then came the noises. At first, they were faint, scratches along the walls, soft taps on the floor above, whispers that seemed to curl just beyond comprehension. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, the settling of the house, the old pipes. But that evening, as I sat in my kitchen, I heard it again, slow, deliberate tapping, like claws dragging along the wood. Not random, not accidental, deliberate. I froze listening. The sound came from the basement of my own house, though I knew I had no one living there. No one except the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. My pulse thundered in my ears. I told myself to ignore it, to rationalize it, but I couldn't. The sound persisted, crawling closer, almost tactile, pressing against the walls in ways I could feel as much as hear. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitated, and descended the stairs. The basement smelled of dampness, but there was something else, something under it, something sharper, metallic, rotten. My light flickered across the walls, and that's when I noticed the traces. Faint scratches on the concrete floor, long and shallow, as if something had crawled across the ground. Not footprints, not paw prints, but dragging, deliberate lines, moving toward a corner shrouded in shadows. I froze. My stomach twisted. The scratches weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. They seemed to shift in my vision, moving slightly when I blinked, like the basement itself was breathing, alive with a memory that had been waiting for me. I tried to convince myself to leave, to step back into the ordinary world of sunlight and safe walls. But curiosity, or perhaps fear, propelled me forward. I followed the scratches with my flashlight, trembling, every nerve alert, every sound amplified. And then I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the basement, crawling along the floor. It wasn't human, not fully. Its movements were jerky, wrong, too fast for the length of its limbs. I could barely make out a form, something thin, elongated, pressing against the walls, slipping into spaces that shouldn't exist. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, reflecting my flashlight in a way that made my chest tighten. I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard. The shadow paused, as if curious, then continued its crawl toward the back wall, moving with an unnatural patience. My mouth went dry. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. I realized then that the basement wasn't empty. It hadn't been empty the night I discovered the jars and the journal. Whatever it was, it had been there all along, waiting, watching, learning, and now it was awake. The noises increased. More scratches closer, scraping the walls, the floor, the corners of my mind. Whispers followed, soft and indistinct, curling around the edges of perception. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. I was being observed. My presence mattered. My fear mattered. And yet it didn't strike. Not yet. I stumbled further into the basement, flashlight shaking, eyes straining. The shadows twisted around me, crawling across walls, coiling along pipes, slipping into gaps between boards. Shapes precious beyond my vision, moving too fast or too slow to track, leaving a feeling of being surrounded, yet alone. Something wet brushed my hand. I yelped, jerking back. My light caught a dark smear along the floor, sticky and cold. My stomach heaved. It wasn't blood, not exactly, but it had the same metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to leave, but my feet kept moving, drawn toward the far corner where the scratches led. There, in the darkest corner, I found more jars, like the ones in the old house next door, but smaller, more numerous. Shapes pressed against the glass, some writhing slowly, others still. I couldn't look too long, couldn't process what I was seeing, but I could feel it. Something trapped, something aware, something that had been left here deliberately, preserved by forces I didn't understand. I dropped the flashlight. The shadows reacted instantly. They recoiled from the light's absence, spreading across the walls like ink and water, faster, thicker, suffocating. Whispers swelled into a chorus, pressing against my ears, vibrating in my skull. Panic erupted. I turned to run. The basement felt endless. The stairs I had descended seemed farther away, stretching into darkness, as if the house itself had shifted, reshaping its own geometry to trap me. Shadows skittered across the walls, crawling along the floor, wrapping around my legs like living chains. I ran blindly, hands outstretched, tripping over loose boards. The whispers clawed at my mind, promising horrors I couldn't imagine, and yet somehow understood. I reached the stairs. My hands gripped the railing, splintering under my fingers. I climbed, each step a battle against the weight pressing down from below. The shadows followed, rising just enough to make the air thick, almost tangible with fear. The whispering escalated, urgent, demanding, echoing in my head, and I realized something. The basement wasn't just alive. It was hungry, not for flesh, not yet, but for attention, for acknowledgement, for me to witness its secrets. I burst into the kitchen, gasping, shaking, and slammed the basement door behind me. My chest heaved. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold the flashlight. I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath, telling myself it was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The basement remembered me now. The shadows knew I had seen them, and that meant they were awake, waiting for the next moment to test me again. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every sigh of the house above me made me flinch. Shadows in the corners of my vision seemed to twitch, to stretch toward me, to linger a moment longer than they should. Even in the daylight, I could feel them crawling just beyond the edge of perception, patient, deliberate, unrelenting. I started noticing more signs during the day. Small scratches along the baseboards of my own home. Objects slightly moved from where I remembered them. Shadows bending at odd angles, even in bright sunlight. The feeling of being watched never left. Sometimes I would glance at the basement door and swear I saw a shape press against it, waiting for me to return. I can't explain it rationally. Logic fails here. Science fails. Even memory feels unreliable now, as if the basement has begun to shape my recollections, bending my understanding of reality. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And yet, I wonder if part of me is imagining or if the basement is testing me, playing with my perception, coaxing me towards something I am not ready to face. The whispers are always there now, faint when I speak to neighbors, nearly imperceptible in the street. But when I am alone, they swell, curling around me, teasing, daring me to go back. I don't want to. I know better. And yet, I feel that pull, The same pull I felt in the old house next door. The same pull I cannot resist. I've stopped going near the house next door, but the memories linger. And the basement, my own basement, waits. The shadows have grown bolder. They move in ways that defy explanation, slipping between walls, brushing along my feet when I am standing still. I can hear them in the dark, whispering, crawling, stretching, patient and terrible. I don't know how long this will last. I don't know what they want, but I do know this. The shadows are not just in the basement. They are in me. They watch me. They remember me. And the longer I remain, the more I understand that I am part of whatever lives beneath the floorboards, and it is already decided that I am worth its attention. I knew I shouldn't go back. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to stay away, to leave the basement alone, to pretend I had never seen the scratches, the jars, the shadows. But some deeper part of me, the part one hated, needed to know, needed to see it, needed to understand. That night, the house was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual groans of settling would seem hushed, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I carried the flashlight with trembling hands, the beam slicing through the darkness, painting the familiar path to the basement with a thin strip of light. Every step felt heavier than the last. Every sound, every creak, every whisper wind pressed on me like a warning. When I reached the basement door, my fingers lingered on the handle. Cold, worn wood, smooth from years of use. And beneath it, a subtle vibration, faint but undeniable, as if the basement itself was alive, waiting for me. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my chest, in my ears, in my skull. I forced the door open and descended the stairs, the smell of damp and rot wrapping around me like a living thing. The basement was darker than before. Shadows pooled in every corner, thick and unmoving, yet I knew they were alive. I could feel their awareness, their focus, as though I were being studied. The scratches along the floor seemed fresher now, sharper, dragging toward the far corner, where the last time I had seen the jars. I moved cautiously, flashlight shaking. Every step I took felt like stepping deeper into someone else's nightmare. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, some trick of my mind, my flashlight, the warped walls. But it moved, slowly, impossibly, crawling along the floor with a fluidity that made my stomach twist. Its limbs were thin, elongated, bent at angles they shouldn't be able to bend. Its head tilted in ways that no living creature could manage. And yet, it was alive, or something like it. It regarded me with a patience that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose board, my flashlight bouncing across the floor. When it landed, the beam illuminated the creature more fully, and my stomach turned. Its skin, if you could call it skin, was pale, wet, glistening in the light, stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes, or eye-like orbs, shone faintly with a cold, calculating intelligence. And its mouth, I can't describe it. Not really. It was wrong, jagged, wet, as though the basement itself had molded it from nightmares. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My legs were paralyzed by a terror I hadn't known was possible. The creature tilted its head, mimicking my hesitation, and in that moment I understood. It wasn't just aware of me. It was feeding on my fear. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every racing thought gave it strength. I forced myself to move backward, slowly, keeping my gaze fixed on it. The creature didn't rush me. It didn't need to. Its patience was infinite. The basement seemed to shrink around me, walls bending, shadows thickening, as if the house itself was conspiring with the thing beneath it. My flashlight flickered, and I panicked. Swinging it wildly, the light caught the creature briefly, and in that flash, I saw the remnants of what had been stored in the jars. Shapes pressed against the glass, tiny, malformed, lifeless, and yet eerily aware. And I realized with sickening certainty, this creature had been feeding, preserving, experimenting, or torturing for decades. The jars, the scratches, the markings, they were all part of it. It crawled closer. Every movement was deliberate, methodical, inhuman. I could hear the scrape of its limbs against the floor, the wet sound of something slick rubbing against itself. My mind screamed at me to flee, but the basement seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. There was no escape. I remembered the journal I had found in the old house next door, the words that had burned themselves into my memory. They watch. They wait. The basement remembers. And now I understood. The basement didn't just contain the creature. The basement was a creature, or at least, it was part of it, alive in ways I couldn't understand, extending it into space, pressing me toward the corner, toward the jars, toward the inevitable. My flashlight went out completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. I could hear it then, breathing. No, not breathing. Something deeper, older, resonating in the walls, in the floor, in my chest. Whispers filled the space around me, curling into my ears, shaping my thoughts, making my memories feel like they belonged to someone else. And then I felt it, something wet and cold brushing against my ankle. I screamed, flailing, my hands scraping along the floor. The creature was on me now, crawling, slithering, merging with the shadows, testing my resistance, exploring me. Its presence pressed into my mind, into my chest, squeezing, demanding. I managed to grab a length of pipe lying against the wall. I swung blindly, connecting with something solid. The creature shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound but a vibration that shook my teeth, my skull, my whole body. It recoiled, hissing, wet limbs retreating into the darkness. My chest heaved, lungs burning, but the relief was fleeting. I could still feel it, lingering, patient, waiting for me to falter. I scrambled toward the stairs, hands and knees scraping across the rough concrete. The basement twisted around me, walls stretching impossibly, shadows following, crawling up the steps with me. Every step felt like a battle against gravity, against reality itself. The whispers turned into a chorus, voices overlapping, screaming, hissing, chanting, demanding. I reached the trapdoor and forced it open, heaving myself upward. My fingers tore on the wood, blood mixing with the grime. I slammed it shut behind me and ran to my living room, panting, shaking, hearing every creak of the house as if it were part of the basement itself. Following me, pressing in. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room, flashlight on, scanning every corner of the house. I didn't dare move toward the basement. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light made my heart race. I could feel it watching, crawling beneath the floorboards, preparing for the next time I returned. And yet, despite every rational thought, every scream in my mind to leave alone, to forget it, a part of me knew I would go back. The pull was irresistible. The basement had a grip on me now, a tie deeper than curiosity. It wanted me to return. It had claimed me in ways I couldn't understand, ways I wouldn't survive if I ignored it. The jars, the shadows, the creature, all of it existed as a warning, as a test, as a lure. I had seen what lurked beneath. I had touched it, even if only with my eyes and my fear. And I knew the basement would not let me go easily. It would wait. It would grow. It would come for me in ways I hadn't imagined yet. The final thought before sleep, or something like sleep, claimed me was simple and cold. I wasn't safe in my own home. Not anymore. The creature beneath the basement had learned my shape, my scent, the rhythm of my fear. And I knew, without a doubt, that it would not stop until it had me entirely. And then a faint sound, just beyond the door, beneath the floorboards, a soft, deliberate tapping, waiting, patient, and I realized, with a terror that left my body trembling, that the basement hadn't just remembered me. It had been waiting for this night all along. I first noticed it on a Tuesday. Not the kind of Tuesday that stands out. There was nothing in the weather, nothing in the news, nothing that would make a day feel different from any other. But I felt it in the way people moved, in the way they looked at each other. Something was off. I live in a small town, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where even strangers feel like neighbors if you pass them on the street enough times. I've lived here all my life, and for all my life, I thought I knew this place. But that Tuesday, the familiarity cracked, ever so slightly. I was walking past a little cafe on Main Street when I realized I didn't remember the name of the woman working the counter. Her hair was a bright, careless red. Her eyes a kind of green, that made you notice without meaning to. I used to know her name, or at least I was certain I did. I called out, "Hey, Sarah?" And she blinked at me, confused, then shook her head. I don't think that's my name," she said. Her voice was polite, hesitant, like she wanted to fix something but didn't know how. I laughed it off at first, thinking maybe I had misremembered. But as I walked on, the unease settled into my chest like cold concrete. I started noticing other things. Names I should have remembered were gone. Faces I should have recognized seemed blurry in my memory, like photos left too long in the sun. Mrs. Halverson, the old lady who always sat on the porch across from the post office, waving at everyone who passed, wasn't waving anymore. In fact, when I approached her, she didn't even see me. I said her name out loud, and her head turned slowly, but there was no recognition in her eyes. "Do I know you?" she asked. Her voice trembled, and suddenly she looked fragile, like a doll missing a limb. "Yes," I said, unsure why I sounded so certain. "I mean, we've met many times." I stopped. Her face was blank, unyielding, and the words felt useless. I walked away, the sunlight making everything seem sharper, harsher. The town looked the same, but I felt like I was seeing it wrong. Or maybe everyone else was. By the end of that week, I realized it wasn't just people. Events, too, had started to vanish. A small fair that should have happened last summer. No one remembered it. The anniversary of the old mill fire? "We don't talk about that," someone said, shrugging as if it had never existed. And yet I remembered. I remembered everything. The kind of details that should have been forgotten after years. The smell of smoke, the heat, the way the firefighters' hoses hissed as they struggled to save what little they could. But no one else did. I tried telling people, my friends, my neighbors. The barista who eventually told me her name was not Sarah, but Lila. They looked at me with the same polite confusion, the same hesitation, and then changed the subject. At first, I thought maybe they were joking, playing some kind of cruel prank. But the more I pressed, the more I realized I was the only one remembering. I started keeping notes. I wrote down names, dates, faces, events. Every time I left the house, I carried a notebook. But the more I recorded, the stranger it felt. Like I was chronicling a world only I could see. I scribbled Lila's corrected name multiple times, hoping repetition would make it real for someone else. But nothing changed. Even my own handwriting began to look foreign. One evening, I went to the old library, the one on the edge of town where the smell of paper and dust hits you like a wave. I thought maybe the records would help. Maybe the books would remember what people could not. I found the local newspaper archives from 5 years ago. I flipped through the pages and my heart sank. The articles I remembered, birthday announcements, a story about a lost dog, a mention of the fair that no one recalled. None of it was there. There were gaps, blank spaces where memories should have left their mark. I stared at the pages, running my fingers over the type, desperate for proof that I wasn't imagining it. But the gaps didn't feel like printing errors. They felt deliberate, intentional, like someone had decided that certain things, certain people, didn't matter anymore. It got worse at night. I'd wake up in the middle of a dream, heart hammering, certain I'd just seen someone real, someone important, disappear into the shadows. I'd look around my room, everything familiar, and yet there was a hollow space in my mind where a memory should have been. I tried to tell myself it was stress, exhaustion, the imagination running wild. But deep down I knew something was erasing the town, slowly, carefully, like water eating away at stone. I started noticing gaps in conversations, too. People would mention things I knew had happened, but they spoke with uncertainty or not at all. A friend might say, "Didn't we go to the lake last summer?" And when I answered, certain and vivid, they'd frown. "I don't remember." They'd say. Their faces would twist in confusion, and my stomach would tighten. It wasn't just forgetfulness. It was as if the memory itself had been plucked from existence, leaving nothing behind. I began seeing them, the missing ones in my mind's eye, people who should have been here, who should have been known and remembered, fading at the edges of the crowd. I tried speaking their names aloud, to call them back, but it was useless. No one else ever saw them, and the more I remembered, The more the town seemed to shrink around me, the less real everyone else became. I stopped going to the cafe for a while, fearing another confrontation with Lila or someone else whose identity had slipped from the world. I walked the streets at night, listening to the wind, counting shadows, trying to see what others could not. And sometimes, when the moon was thin and the fog rolled in, I thought I saw them. Faces at windows, fleeting glimpses in mist, but every time I turned, they vanished. I was left alone, whispering names that no one could hear. By the second week, I noticed the silence, not the quiet of an empty street, but the quiet in the air itself, as if sound had started to retreat, leaving only the hollow echoes of memory. People walked past, but their voices seemed muted. Even laughter felt borrowed, distant, like a recording played backwards. The town was breathing, but not alive in the way it had been. And then I noticed the first house that seemed truly empty, not abandoned, not just quiet. Empty. I walked by it, curious, and something made me look closer. A nameplate that should have been there, a name I knew by heart, was gone. The door was shut tight. Windows stared blankly back at me. I could feel the weight of absence pressing against the glass, cold and patient. I didn't knock. I couldn't. The thought of calling out, of insisting someone remember, felt like screaming into a void that might swallow me whole. I kept walking, heart hammering, notebook clutched in my chest. By the time I got home, my hands were shaking. I wrote down every detail I could recall from that street. The houses, the flowers in the yard, the cracked pavement, the names of neighbors who no longer existed in anyone else's mind. I don't know when I realized I was alone in my memory, not just physically, but in a way that matters, a way that feels like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing that the ground behind you has been swallowed. I remember everyone. I remember everything. But no one remembers me. And the town is forgetting faster than I can keep up. I don't know how long it will last. How long I can last. Every day, someone else disappears. Not physically, not in body, but in the soft, insidious erasure of recognition. And I keep walking, I keep writing, I keep remembering. Because if I don't, no one will. Not even me. I went back to the library the next day. Though part of me wanted to stay away, the thought of wandering among those silent shelves, chasing memories that no one else seemed to have, made my chest tighten. But I needed answers, or at least some proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The building smelled the same as always, a mix of dust, mildew, and old paper. I ran my fingers along the spines of books as I walked, tracing names and dates, hoping for a thread to pull. At first, nothing stood out. But then I remembered the old photograph collection tucked away in the local history section, bound in fragile yellowed pages. I found the box under the counter, the clerk barely glancing at me as I took it. Inside were photographs from decades ago, small black and white prints of streets, school events, town celebrations. I recognized many faces instantly, but as I looked closer, my stomach turned. Some of the faces were wrong. It wasn't that they were unfamiliar. They weren't missing. It was the opposite. People I remembered clearly, people who should have been alive and walking the streets now, were there in these photos. But their positions didn't make sense. In one image of a school picnic, a boy I'd grown up next door to was standing in the background, staring directly at the camera, but the date on the print suggested he shouldn't have been born yet. In another, a woman I remembered talking to last week was in a parade float from 10 years ago, smiling in a photograph that never existed in anyone else's memory. I flipped through the photographs faster, my fingers trembling. There were more. Old newspapers. Tucked under the same counter were reels of microfilm, yellowed pages with headlines about events I remembered, tragedies, fairs, elections. But the details were inconsistent, contradictory, impossible. Names changed. Dates shifted. People vanished mid-story, replaced by blank lines or vague references like a resident or someone unknown. I felt like I was staring at a puzzle where the pieces kept moving on their own. I pulled one newspaper from a frame, its edges fraying, and sat down at a reading table. The headline was about a fire at the old textile mill. I had been there the night it happened, watching smoke curl up into the sky, while firefighters fought desperately to save what they could. I could remember every detail. The smell of burning wood, the acrid sting of smoke in my eyes, the shouts, the fear. But the article told a different story. It described the fire as minor, contained quickly, causing no injuries. The mill owner was quoted saying, "Just a small accident, nothing to worry about." The paper mentioned no firefighters, no chaos, no horror. It was like the night I remembered had been swallowed whole and replaced with something smaller, safer, sanitized. I leaned back in my chair, hands pressed against my face. My heartbeat was loud in the quiet library. This wasn't just forgetfulness. This was deliberate. Someone or something was erasing pieces of the town's history, reshaping it to fit a story I wasn't supposed to know. The photographs whispered at the edges of my mind. I kept returning to one in particular, a school dance from 15 years ago. The date was wrong, but the faces were right. Or so I thought. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was a shadow. Not a person exactly, but a dark blur, almost like smoke or a stain. I frowned, leaning closer. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to shift, like it was alive, watching me. I flipped to the next photograph, then the next, and the shadow appeared again. In each image, it lurked at the edges, always the same shape, always blurred, always just out of focus. It wasn't the memory I carried, yet I knew it had always been there. I spent hours going through the papers and photos, my eyes burning, my back aching. The inconsistencies grew. Names I knew vanished completely. Events I remembered happening with dozens of witnesses were described as if no one had seen them. Even I wasn't safe from the erasure. I found myself in some photographs, present in places I had no memory of attending, smiling at cameras I didn't recognize. By late afternoon, the library was quiet. The sunlight slanted through tall windows, making dust motes floating golden streams. I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone all day. No one had asked me what I was doing. No one had noticed me sitting there, poring over the town's altered history. The silence felt alive, pressing against me. I needed to leave, but something held me there. Curiosity, fear, or maybe a stubborn insistence that I had to see this through. I pulled one last reel of microfilm from the shelf. The label read, Town Events 1970 to 1990. I fed it into the reader, and as the pages rolled, I felt the familiar sense of unease settling in. The first articles were normal enough. Announcements of births, marriages, town council meetings. Then the inconsistencies began. A man I knew had lived in town his entire life was listed as moving away, then returning years later. Though I could remember him never leaving, a building I remembered burning to the ground was described as still standing. And then I noticed it. Some of the words on the pages were missing. Not faded, not smudged, simply gone. Entire paragraphs erased, leaving empty spaces where the story should have been. I ran my finger over the gaps, expecting to feel indentations, but the paper was smooth, clean. My pulse raced. I tried to read through the gaps, but my mind resisted. Every time I approached a blank space, an image flashed in my memory, like a warning. Faces I should have known, events I should have remembered, screaming at me silently, and then they vanished, leaving only the emptiness on the page and the weight of my own knowledge. I realized the shadows weren't just in the photographs. They were in the records, in the newspapers, in the very fabric of the town's history. Someone had been rewriting it for years, decades even, erasing things, people, moments, until what remained was safe, controllable, forgettable. A sudden movement caught my eye. The library door creaked, and I turned sharply. No one was there. I must have imagined it. But when I looked back at the microfilm, the blank spaces had grown. New lines of text were gone that hadn't been missing a moment ago. I froze, heart thudding. I wasn't imagining it. The records were changing in real time. Or at least, that's how it felt. Each erased name, each altered date, was another piece of the town vanishing, and I was the only one left to witness it. I tried to close the reel, to shove the box back under the counter and leave, but I couldn't. I needed to see more. I needed to understand how deep it went. I fed another reel into the reader, labeled Miscellaneous 1940 to 1970. The pattern continued. Inconsistencies, missing paragraphs, photographs that shifted slightly when I looked away, faces that blurred and reformed as if resisting observation. One photo made me gasp. A group of children playing in a park. At the center was a girl I remembered clearly from my childhood, a friend whose name I could not bear to speak aloud, because I knew that for everyone else, she didn't exist. I leaned in closer. Her face was twisted, blurred, almost like the shadow was taking her from the photograph. I reached out my finger, but the paper felt normal, and when I blinked, her face was gone entirely, replaced with blank space, a smear where memory refused a hold. I stumbled back on the table, my notebook falling to the floor. I tried to jot everything down, to anchor myself to reality I still carried in my mind, but my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the pen. Every photograph, every article, every memory I thought was permanent was slipping, reshaped by something I couldn't name. I left the library that evening, clutching my notebook like a lifeline. Outside, the streets were empty, though it wasn't late. The sunset cast long shadows, and I could swear they moved differently than they should have, bending around corners that weren't there, stretching over buildings in ways that made the familiar town seem alien. Walking home, I kept thinking about the shadows and the records, the missing paragraphs, the faces that disappeared from photographs. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching, following the thread of my awareness, erasing and rewriting, making sure I remain aware but powerless to stop it. At night, in my small bedroom, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The photographs and newspapers haunted me, not just in memory, but in the silence around me. I could feel them everywhere, the absence of what should have been, pressing against reality like wet paper clinging to skin. I had never felt so alone, even in a town full of people. And I understood then, fully, that remembering was no longer enough. Witnessing, recording, keeping the past alive in my mind. It might not be enough to hold it back. The shadows and the records weren't just mistakes. They were warnings. A signal that everything I knew, everything the town had been, was slipping. And if I didn't find a way to fight it, I would be next. Not physically, but in the erasure of memory. Forgotten. Gone. I don't know if anyone else will ever see what I saw. I don't know if they would believe me if they did. But I remember. And remembering is all I have. It started slowly at first. I would walk past someone I had known all my life, and their face would go blank for a fraction of a second before settling into a polite, distant smile. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination, a trick of memory. But the moments grew longer, sharper, and soon I realized the truth. Some people had stopped existing in the minds of everyone around me. I could remember them. I could remember the sound of their voices, the way their hands moved when they talked, the little quirks that made them human. But no one else could. The world itself had decided they didn't matter, and the thought filled me with a quiet terror. It was Mrs. Halverson who finally made it real. The old lady on the porch, the one who had always waved at me on my way to the store, was gone. Not gone like she had moved or passed away. Gone like she had never been. I walked past her porch one morning, notebook clutched tightly against my chest, and the house felt empty. No chair on the porch, no waving hand, not even the faint scent of her gardenias drifting into the street. My stomach turned over. I whispered her name, almost hoping she would appear, but there was only silence. I started keeping track, marking every disappearance in my notebook. Some were easy, neighbors who hadn't existed in the newspapers or photographs I had gone through. Some were subtle, friends who suddenly couldn't recall events we had shared. Every name I wrote felt heavier than the last, like ink drawing the weight of absence on the paper. And then I realized something worse. Not everyone who disappeared was gone from my mind entirely. Some of them weren't meant to be remembered, no matter how hard I tried. No matter how many notes I took, certain faces refused to stay, fading like smoke through my fingers. The harder I held on to them, the more they slipped. I started dreaming of them. In my sleep, they walked beside me, speaking in voices I could almost hear but never fully understand. Their eyes were familiar, desperate, and pleading, and every time I reached out, they dissolved into shadow. I woke up with my sheets soaked in sweat, and the memory of them burned behind my eyelids, threatening to vanish if I blinked. The town itself became a stranger. Streets I had walked 100 times felt narrower, sharper, like the world was shrinking around me. I could sense the absences more than see them. A missing laugh, a broken rhythm in conversation, a shadow where someone should have been. It was as if reality itself was adjusting, erasing the traces of existence that didn't belong. One evening, I wandered to the cemetery on the edge of town. Graves had always been comforting in a way, solid markers of lives lived, of names remembered. But now, even the cemetery was strange. Some graves were empty. Headstones bore names I had never seen. Some faded beyond recognition. And then I noticed one that should have been there, but wasn't. A friend from childhood. A boy named Peter, who I could remember with absolute clarity. Yet no stone marked his passing. No one else remembered him at all. I sank to my knees in the dirt, clutching the notebook to my chest. Tears burned my eyes. I whispered his name again and again, willing the world to acknowledge him, to remember him. But the earth beneath me was silent, unmoved, indifferent. It wasn't just that Peter had been forgotten. It was that the town had never allowed him to exist. And that realization was heavier than grief, colder than fear. I started avoiding the streets during the day, walking at night instead. The darkness was quieter, safer in a way, though I could still feel the weight of absence pressing in from the edges of the world. Shadows moved oddly, stretching over buildings in ways that didn't match the moonlight. I thought I saw shapes at the edges of alleys, figures standing just beyond perception, watching, waiting. But when I turned, there was nothing, always nothing. The notebook became my lifeline. Every night, I wrote furiously, recording names, faces, memories. I tried to capture the ones who were slipping, who might be forgotten tomorrow, or the next day. But the harder I tried, the more the town resisted. Certain entries blurred overnight, letters fading into nothing. I woke to find passages erased, blank pages where my own memories had been written. I would try to rewrite them, but they slipped further away, like water soaking through paper. It was then that I noticed a pattern. The disappearances weren't random. Some people could be saved in memory if I focused, repeated their names, recalled every detail. Others resisted. No matter how hard I tried, they were beyond reach. The town had decided, and I was powerless. Some were never meant to exist. Some were never meant to be remembered. I thought about Lila, the barista whose name I had gotten wrong, the woman who looked at me with confusion when I tried to speak to her. I had insisted on remembering her, writing her name down repeatedly. And yet, the more I tried, the more her features shifted in my mind, subtle differences I couldn't reconcile. I realized then that even the act of remembering could be corrupted, that memory itself was fragile, pliable, and not entirely mind-controlled. I started hearing whispers in the corners of my mind, not voices outside, but inside me. Echoes of names I couldn't hold, fragmented conversations I should have remembered. They slipped through my consciousness, teasing, reminding me of all that had vanished. Sometimes I could make out the words, "Forget me, don't remember, not yours." And every time I did, a chill ran down my spine. The town became quieter, emptier. I walked streets that should have been familiar, but each turn revealed subtle differences. Houses I knew had disappeared. Fences were missing. Gardens had vanished. Even the skyline was changing, subtle shifts that made it impossible to tell what had always been there and what had been erased. I tried to speak to someone, anyone, about it, but the words faltered on my lips. How do you explain a town that forgets? How do you convince someone that their neighbors, their friends, their own memories are being rewritten? They would look at me with polite concern, maybe a hint of fear, and then continue as if nothing were wrong, as if nothing had changed. One night, I walked past the old playground, the swings creaking in the wind. I remembered laughing there as a child, the sound of children running, the smell of fresh-cut grass and the tang of metal slides in the sun. But now it was empty. The swings moved on their own in a silent breeze, and the laughter was gone. I called out names I remembered, children who should have been playing, friends who had vanished from memory, and the only answer was the echo of my own voice. I thought of all the faces I had tried to hold on to. I could still picture some, just barely, but others were gone entirely. Their names, their expressions, their voices, all erased from my mind. as if they had never been, and in the empty spaces left behind, I could feel the intention. The town had decided, and the erasure was complete. I realized then that the shadow wasn't in the photographs or the newspapers. It wasn't in the empty streets or the fading voices. It was in the will of the town itself, patient, deliberate, reshaping reality to its own design. And I, standing in the middle of it, could only watch, powerless to stop it. I tried to resist. I shouted names into the night, traced faces in my notebook, begged the wind to carry memories back. But the more I tried, the more the town pressed in, smoothing over the gaps, erasing the edges, until even my own certainty felt shaky. Some people I would never be able to save, no matter how hard I remembered, and the thought of it settled over me like a shroud. By the time I returned home that night, the town had grown silent. Windows reflected empty streets. The faint rustle of leaves in the wind sounded louder than any conversation. I could feel the absence pressing in, cold and deliberate, a reminder that some things were never meant to be recalled. I sat at my desk, notebook open, pen trembling in my hand. I wrote the names I could still remember, the ones I could still anchor in my mind. And as I wrote, I realized that even this might not be enough. Memory alone could not resist the erasure, could not protect those who were never meant to exist. I looked around my room, familiar objects in place, yet everything felt fragile, temporary, like a dream that could dissolve at any moment. I thought about the people I had loved, the ones I had known, the ones I had tried to save in memory, and I knew that some of them would be gone tomorrow, or the day after, or maybe already were, and I just hadn't realized it yet. And then the thought struck me, maybe some disappearances aren't mistakes. Maybe some people are never meant to be remembered, and maybe I'm only here to witness it, powerless, clutching at fragments that will slip through my fingers no matter how tightly I hold. I don't know if I'll be able to keep remembering forever. I don't know if my own mind will be next, or if the town will decide to erase me too, folding my existence into the blank spaces it creates. I can't tell who is gone and who will be gone next. All I know is the weight of absence, the cold certainty that some memories are beyond my reach. I lie awake at night, listening to the silence, feeling the spaces where people should be, where they used to be, and wondering if anyone will ever remember them or me. And as I drift into restless sleep, I feel the shadows at the edges of my mind, whispering just beyond comprehension, telling me that some things are not mine to hold, and I fear they are right.